If all else failed and she didn't want to kill him, enslaving him was an option. Perhaps then, she could work out a method to restore his mind through various experiments. She had other ideas that might have worked too, but they were either even more ruthless than temporarily enslaving his soul, or even more idealistic than trying to teach him a mental technique when his mind was already gone. Gaia imperceptibly sighed. She had to admit that this was a problem created by her negligence. Ever since her soul level had reverted to its origin state because of her reincarnation, her mind had been open to the influence of things like normality bias, which, along with other things, had caused her to become complacent. Normality bias was a unique cognitive function that made a person ignore or even deny things that they might have seen or heard, simply because it didn't, in that moment, make a lick of sense. For example, someone might feel a sudden sharp pain in their arm, but because there was no rhyme or reason for why that might have happened, they came up with half-hearted excuses, perhaps thinking that it was the positioning of their arm that caused the pain, even if they knew deep down that their arm did not give any prior discomfort and couldn't suddenly just give a sharp pain. Or even better, they outright ignored it. The pain's gone, everything's back to normal. No need to think about it anymore since I don't even know what happened in the first place. What a mistake. But what else could they do? Dig underneath their skin to find the reason for a sudden random pain in their body, each and every time it happened? No. That's not how an intelligent species operated. There was always something more important to think about, and unless it wasn't a big problem, if they couldn't make heads or tails about it, it tended to be ignored. Of course, this changed when a being ascended and they began to take everything and anything into account when making decisions, but that's besides the point. In Gaia's own case, the normality which she was biased to was that people with strong wills were able to resist the influence of the sins. And so, each time she might have been given a prompt to make defenses against the enthrallment of the sins, she pushed it to the back of her mind. After all, she was extremely busy. She needed to prioritize the more pressing things, right? Something that isn't an immediate or even an intimidating problem can definitely wait, right? It was notions like that, coupled with other more minor things like the innate pride that coursed through her blood as not only the one and only creation dragon, but also a goddess and ex-immortal from a law world, that caused her to ignore the threat of the sin's enthrallment. Now look at the situation. But if there was one life lesson thing that she had learned as an immortal that would never leave her no matter what state her soul was in, it was that everything was her fault. All the good things and the bad things that happened in her life were all her fault. If she was beaten and tortured, it was her fault. She should have been strong enough to defend herself, or she shouldn't have placed herself in a situation where someone who wanted to torment her could gain access to her. If she was robbed, it was her fault. Her security shouldn't have been so low that it was breachable. Likewise, if she suddenly became a goddess like she was today, it was her fault. It was her mind that had attracted the man that made her a goddess. Becoming the spiritual figure of all dragons in the Dragon Mountain? It was naturally her own fault. It was all the scheming that she had done in the past that had allowed her to seamlessly make every dragon on this mountain a devout or her divinity. Everything that happened to her was her fault. So the fact that Eshma had been reduced to this state was very much her fault. She should not have ignored the threat of the sin's enthrallment, no matter how insignificant it had previously seemed. She should not have allowed arrogance to pervade her mindset, no matter how big the list of her accomplishments were. And she should not have become complacent, no matter how ironically peaceful her time in this crazy world had been. Now, she was going to have to rectify her mistakes. She hardened her resolve and contracted her wings, causing her large body to descend. And with a few graceful flaps here and there to steer her direction, it became obvious to everyone watching that she was making her way over to the growing encased form of Eshma. She had made the decision to enslave his soul. Far, far below, in a different location of the origin forest, 3 humanoids stood at the peak of a rather large grass hill. It was tall enough to pierce through the canopy of tree leaves, which allowed the 3 standing at its peak to gaze at the sky without any obstruction, but compared to the Dragon Mountain in the distance, it was very, very small. The 3 standing at the top of this hill were none other than the 3 visitors from the West Continent, the 9-Flame Queen, the Phoenix King, and the Phoenix Queen. All of them peered up at the sky with difficult expressions on their faces. Chad, the Phoenix Queen, called out worriedly as she shifted her attention to the man on her right. However, despite the wariness she was feeling due to the situation in the sky, seeing Chad's visage, she fell into a slight daze. The Phoenix King looked incredibly handsome as always, nobody could dispute that, but it was somewhat rare for her to see him looking serious like this. his golden eyes burning like eternal flames, his similarly colored flame-like hair billowing with the wind, his spotless and imposing wings burning with the ferocity that could only belong to a warrior, his brow furrowed and his jaw clenched. She liked the look of it. A lot. She felt a little guilty because the emotions that created that face weren't exactly good ones, but no matter what she tried to tell herself, her lady bits warmed. Something she was accustomed to feeling whenever she was with this man. Chad lowered his head to look down at her, and almost immediately his eyes softened, turning the previous vicious and boundless flames into gentle and harmless ones that melted her heart. The worry she had been feeling greatly dissipated. "Do not worry, Aliana. With me here nothing can harm you," Chad said as he tried to gather her in his arms. But despite the reluctant effort and the discomfort it took to do so, she held his arms before he could grab her, ignoring his steel-like muscles that compelled her to swoon, and spoke out with steel in her voice. "Stop it," she moaned. Her voice was not supposed to sound like that. Chad smirked before dropping his arms, but before she could sigh with relief or disappointment, he held her hands together within his own and leaned closer with a mischievous glint in his eyes. Yes. My blue rose is a cruel and powerful ice queen. How can she possibly be caught snuggling with a man?" Aliana blushed heavily. "Will you dash? Are you two actually serious? Are my eyes and ears deceiving me?" A sharp and very angry voice spoke out. Chad let go of Alina with a roll of his eyes, and they both turned to face the source of the voice, which naturally turned out to be the Nine-Flame Queen. A livid and fuming Nine-Flame Queen, who was almost leaking dark red flames out of her eyes. But despite the vicious expression contorting her face, she was still an extreme beauty. In fact, both Aliana and the Nine-Flame Queen were. But where Aliana was the epitome of grace and elegance with a hint of mischievous allure, the Nine-Flame Queen had seduction carved through every inch of her body, with a pair of dark mysterious eyes that drew everyone in. Aliana had pale skin, straight long icy blue hair and similar colored eyes. Her bust and behind weren't as dynamic as she probably wanted it to be, but she possessed such a unique and delicate femininity to her overall shape that she didn't lose out to others at all. The feeling she gave off was similar to that of an ice sculpture of a goddess, delicate yet imposingly majestic. But on the other hand, the Nine-Flame Queen, who still had not obtained an actual name yet, was almost Aliana's complete opposite. Her skin was tanned, her hair was mainly dark red with bright red highlights, her eyes were narrow and seductive, with her irises being an even darker red that looked like wine. Her bust, hips, buttocks and thighs were the things of dreams, and she even had plump, biteable cupid bow lips to top it off. Sexual enticement at its finest. But more interesting than those features, at least to Chad and Aliana, were the 4 horns adorning her skull, 2 on the sides of her head and the other 2 on her forehead. Those dark red horns that never stopped burning were unlike anything they had ever seen or sensed before. They radiated a harrowing feeling of killing intent and were one of the few main reasons why Chad had made the decision never to let his guard down around her. Evidently, the fact that she was not fully a beast could be sensed. But besides that, the only similar thing between the 2 girls was their height, both being around 175 centimeters tall, and that was it. The Nine-Flame Queen venomously glared at the 2 rulers of the Phoenix race, with her aura beginning to leak out of her skin in the form of dark red flames, her horns and eyes beginning to glow menacingly. "This woman is too much," Chad thought inwardly with frustration. The Nine-Flame Queen's personality was always like this. She was incredibly sexy, even he had to admit, but she was just too violent. The amount of crazy things she had done just because something had angered her was sickening, and he had always wanted to punish her somehow, but what could he do? She was stronger than him. Chad didn't know how she progressed so quickly, but she was at the 6th stage, whereas he was at the 3rd stage. Although he knew that he was talented enough to fight people in higher stages because of the fortunes that had been bestowed upon him, he was very sure that the Nine-Flame Queen could accomplish the same thing, perhaps to an even greater extent, relegating his advantage. Between the 2 of them there was no comparison. Fortunately, they could be considered allies, especially since something even more monstrous than her was coming for them. Chad's mood dampened even further as he thought about his despicable brother. Still, despite the insecurities assailing his heart, he spoke out confidently with a placating smile. "Relax, Nine-Flame, no matter what's going on above, the dragons would have to deal with it first before it can ever affect us." He made an instinctive move to stand in front of Aliana, but changed his mind halfway with a little reluctance, allowing her to stand beside him. Ever since he had taken Aliana as his one true mate, turning her into the queen of all phoenixes, she had made the decision to, in her own words, reform herself as a true queen and make herself equal to him so that she didn't shame him. Something that he had mixed feelings about. He appreciated it a lot, after all, to have a powerful mate who could take care of the phoenix race with him was amazing, but it meant that he had to hold back a lot when he felt the urge to protect her. Alas, what can he do? He could only support her in this endeavor and hope that she could quickly reach his level, removing some of the worries that he had. Whoosh! His chain of thought broke when the 9 Flame Queen's aura flared even higher. Fuck! Is she going to punch me again? Chad grimaced as held his arms up. Fuck! Is she going to punch me again? Chad grimaced as held his arms up. And indeed, a long perfectly tanned leg swept towards his head with domineering might that sent a chill down his spine. Not quite the punch he was expecting, but a brutal kick that was quite a few times worse. The 9 Flame Queen was really mad this time, she even dared to use those perverse kicks of hers. Not even thinking for a second that he could block it, he swiftly leaned backwards and narrowly dodged it, his pupils constricting greatly as he watched the tantalizing murder weapon flash across his view as if it was an executioner's blade. And for all intents and purposes, it might as well have been one. He quickly regained his bearing and made 2 hops backwards, but as he did so, he caught sight of something that made his heart almost burst out of his chest. Aliana, in all of her ethereal beauty, was swinging a punch at the 9 Flame Queen with a mana-enhanced fist and a very angry expression. No. Chad's face paled. Actually, despite his very real near-death scenario, he knew that the 9 Flame Queen wasn't actually out to kill him, no matter how angry she was. After all, not only was the 9 Flame Queen in 6th stage enlightened beast, 4th realm, she was also quite accomplished in anatomy refinement, with her legs being the primary focus of that refinement. If she really wanted to kill him or at least cause him severe harm with that single kick, she could do it. But she didn't. At the end of the day, they were definitely allies. She knew that he could dodge her kick at that speed and probably only wanted to frighten him, letting him know how angry and serious she was. If she wanted to hurt him, a simple punch that wouldn't take his life would suffice. The 9 Flame Queen was in control of her actions. But, seeing Aliana rush towards that unscrupulous menace with such hostile intent that would undoubtedly be returned in kind, he imagined the worse. Gritting his teeth, he swiveled around, using his mana to assist him in the unnatural movement, and successfully redirected the velocity of body, so instead of moving backwards he was now moving forwards. However, his speed had been sacrificed by over 10 times. This maneuver of his had only given him the total value of a single step forwards. But it was enough. When his feet finally met contact with the ground, he quickly sent a good portion of his mana into his legs, which inevitably doused them in golden flames, and immediately pushed off with all of his strength. Was he trying to attack the 9 Flame Queen? No. That would be foolish and very counterproductive. Instead, he flashed by Aliana's side before her fist could even land on the awaiting Vermilion Bird's contempt-filled face and grasped her by the waist, pulling her to his side and putting an end to the heart attack-inducing punch. But because he had sacrificed control in order to achieve maximum speed as soon as his legs had touched the ground, his body ended up helplessly speeding past the 9 Flame Queen, dragging Aliana along with him. Fortunately, he was a bird and was very adept in the air. After traveling roughly 20 meters he regained some control of his body and was able to land on his feet, kicking up a cloud of dirt as he skidded to a stop. And when he did come to a stop, he pushed Aliana behind him, no longer able to condone her desires for independence. Finally, he faced the 9 Flame Queen, his body tense despite the fact that his mind was telling him that none of them were in danger. Like this, a tense moment passed as the cloud of dust gradually dispersed. 2 sets of glowing eyes, gold and blue, staring at a pair of red ones. Eventually, the 9 Flame Queen was the one to break eye contact first and returned her attention back to the sky. But the 2 rulers of the Phoenix race continued to stare at her with uncanny focus, holding each other in a tense manner with their chests visibly heaving as if they were about to go feral. Soon enough, the 9 Flame Queen couldn't take it anymore and looked back at them with a look of annoyance. Humph, you should take a look at yourselves. Such wild eyes, you look like you've reverted back to the magic beast realm and are going feral. If you don't stop looking at me like that I'll pluck out both of your eyes. These words only caused the 2 of them to clutch each other even tighter. 9 Flame Queen's eyes narrowed. She had miscalculated. She didn't know what was up about the relationship between these 2 phoenixes, but it was absolutely not normal. It was especially strange because in the beginning, these two individuals could not hate each other any further. One was an arrogant king, and the other was the daughter of that king's most hated enemy and his violated mate. The fact that she was alive was a miracle in on itself, so it wasn't surprising when she obtained information stating that the child born between that accursed union was living a very sorrowful life, along with all the other ice phoenixes, but perhaps even more so. However, in later years, she had heard that the king had developed a somewhat unnatural obsession with the girl, so much so that it was beginning to affect his duties and people were beginning to find out. And it was indeed so. When she traveled to his territory for a meeting, the girl had been there, working as a slave and cleaning the room with a spiteful face. When she stated that such a lowly girl wasn't worthy of listening to their conversation, he had growled at her and told her that what he did with his slaves and where he placed them was none of her concern. Of course, she punched him for that. How dare he speak to her like that? But she didn't fail to notice the burning blue eyes that glared at her in response. Very strange. On top of that, Chad was adamant about the girl staying, so she gave him a few more punches. But not because she was all that angry, but because she wanted to test something. And lo and behold, the girl, the slave, started growling at her. What? What? A mere creature in the magic beast realm? 3 realms below her? She still remembered her shock back then. So deciding that it was worthy of further investigation, she allowed the girl to stay, and during the entire meeting, the two phoenixes kept taking peeks at each other, their innocent eyes turning into hate-filled glares when they caught each other staring. What kind of joke was this? Years after that passed and she started to hear even more intriguing information. The Phoenix King had not only begun to personally train the girl, even feeding her with precious magical herbs and corpses of powerful creatures, but he had also begun to make abnormal disappearances with her. The official statement was that he had taken her to secluded places where she could fight powerful beasts, but of course not too powerful, without distraction, and although many people had believed that in the beginning, herself included, things changed when people around the king began to notice changes in his personality. Before, his entire demeanor carried the razor-sharp edge of resentment and suppressed rage that made the people around him feel wary. As a phoenix, he was innately graceful, so it wasn't too bad, but back then, Chad was truly a wild card that would blow up at the most random of times. But then one day, he came back from who knows where with a blue-haired humanoid girl in his arms and a wide smile on his face. Naturally, the first thing that shocked everyone was the smile. Apparently he hadn't smiled in years and the sight of it caused the many phoenixes to be dazed, but she didn't care about that. The next thing that caused everyone to be shocked was that he was carrying a female in his arms and that they were clearly intimate. This was great news to them. After all, ever since Chad's previous mates had died, he had not only discarded all the female birds he had been impregnating in hopes of increasing his phoenix army, but he had also completely stopped having relations with females. But obviously, with a female in his arms and a wide smile on his face, it was a sign that things were about to change, and they were glad. They didn't even care that the female, with her big blue wings on her back, was clearly an ice phoenix. The king's happiness was their happiness. But she didn't care about that information either. Whether Chad would sulk for eternity or not was none of her concern. It was the next piece of information that stunned not only her, but everyone else on the continent. And that was the fact that the identity of that female was none other than the slave girl, the daughter of the so-called despicable brother. But although that was quite a bit surprising, quite a few people had suspected the relationship between her and the king and weren't too surprised. The actual shocking factor was the fact that she was in the second realm. How could a mere spirit beast possibly access the enlightened form of an enlightened beast? That simply wasn't possible. Or at least, it was supposed to be. But here the girl was in the flesh, glaring at her like an anxious mother as she clutched Chad's side with her very humanoid fingers. Even now, despite the fact that she had met with the girl multiple times since the event, she still felt a little of the shock that she felt back when she first found out. And even now, despite being pressured from all sides, Chad had absolutely refused to reveal how it happened. Sometimes, she really wanted to kill him. In any case, after that event, although their relationship wasn't immediately revealed, the treatment of all ice phoenixes across the continent had improved drastically, being treated no different from the pure phoenixes. Even the slaves that she had captured or bought with resources had to be returned to the pure society without harm, or there was the promise of war. That threat from the king even sent a chill down her own spine, talk less of others. Not that she wasn't afraid of him, but even she did not want a repeat of the Great War that spanned across the entire continent. Actually, something like that would be very beneficial to her cultivation. After all, she was still half monster, a demon king at that, and that came with benefits that could be fully excavated by the act of killing. But she wasn't fully a monster anymore, and she had descendants that she cared about. So she decided to give back the ice phoenixes without making too much of a fuss. Of course, as the strongest being on the continent, she wasn't someone that could be bullied or threatened into doing anything, so she made him pay for those ice phoenixes in resources. Thankfully, after a few complaints about the price and rude name-callings that she almost punched him for, he paid, and that was that. It had to be said that initially she wanted the secrets of Aliana's transformation, but the response was that if she kept pressing about it, he would kidnap those ice phoenixes forcefully, ignite their mana course so that they were destined to explode, and throw them right back at her, turning the entire purgatory forest into a frozen wasteland whether she survived or not. And that would be the start of the war. What a personality shift that was. It was kind of exciting thinking back on it. But she hadn't found it so funny back then, so she had to admit, she was actually cowed into stepping back and asking for resources instead. It wasn't that she was scared, it was just that although she herself didn't need to fear exploding phoenixes too much, the same could not be said for her territory and the people within. In fact, even if she could somehow perfectly protect her descendants, just the thought of multiple exploding ice phoenixes rearranging the topography of her forest and turning it into an icy wasteland was enough to make her make concessions. Normally, such a thing was not a worry. After all, even the despicable brother didn't dare to do such a heinous thing. And even if he did, he definitely would not be sacrificing the amount needed to turn the purgatory forest into a wasteland. It was just too big of a cost. But there was something in Chad's eyes, something that she would notice in his eyes each time something threatened his so-called one true mate, that made her believe him. And that was one of the best decisions she had ever made, because in the future, there was an event that ended up causing very severe harm to Aliana, so much so that she almost became a cripple. This resulted in a 5, not 1, not 2, not 3, but a 5-year-long lesson that the entire continent would never forget. In any case, years had passed since then, and here they were. She, the Nine-Flame Queen, did not dare to touch this mad king's mate. What was he dancing around for? A minute or two passed and Chad and Aliana began to gradually calm down, soon feeling embarrassed about their overreactions. Aliana even started to blush a little as she let go of Chad and took a couple steps away from him. It was always like this. They knew that they were overly protective of each other, and even a small offense to one of them would provoke the other, but they couldn't help it. Chad coughed into his hand before forcibly relaxing his body and putting on a comfortable smile. My apologies, Nine-Flame. Please do not take offense to my actions. The Nine-Flame Queen's lips twitched, amused but also annoyed by the obnoxious facade. This guy really knew how to act. She stared at him with narrowed eyes for a moment before turning her body around and looking at the sky. All is well, but focus now and do not be distracted again. That thing in the sky is not to be taken lightly. Chad and Aliana frowned before they too started to stare at the sky again. Actually, although they looked at the sky as if they could see what they were vaguely detecting, that simply was not true at all. Yes, Chad and the Nine-Flame were in the 4th realm, and they also had astonishing foundations that made them even greater than their peers. But it was definitely not enough. To peer at the 15 peaks of the Dragon Mountain from the ground, using spirit sense or not, was just not possible for people like them, talk less of Aliana, who was in the 3rd realm. But that being said, the cause of the malevolent aura was so great that its aura had descended down the mountain to a point where all 3 of them could sense it. So although they could not sense the cause in the slightest, they could sense its aura, and the vicious brutality within it caused them to worry greatly. The creature or object that could emit such a thing was definitely not to be taken lightly. Phoenix, don't you think that this aura possesses similarities to that of your brother's? Nine-Flame suddenly spoke out. Chad's face twisted. Don't you dare call that person, my brother. He wanted to say something a whole lot worse than person, because that heinous cretin did not qualify for that term at all, but because of how in tune he was with Aliana, possessing the ability to notice each of her movements and sometimes even her emotions, he quickly recognized that her head was downcast and felt a flash of sadness that wasn't his own. Having heard the cruel stories about her father, Aliana had come to hate him like anyone else. But at the end of the day, she was still his daughter. But make no mistake, The sadness that she felt was not because of some small amount of filial piety that upsetted her any time her father was insulted, not at all. What she felt was great shame. Although the phoenixes back home had warmly accepted her in the beginning, happy for the changes that she had brought within their king, it only took 5 or so years for people to get used to the fact that the king was once again an all-benevolent one, and that her presence, for all intents and purposes in their view, had achieved its purpose. They felt that there was no longer a need for them to respect her as they did before. Now of course, that didn't mean that they suddenly treated her badly. A lot of people had come to know her and like her, regardless of her high status. But there were also the people who Chad liked to call spiteful and jealous right before he killed them, that would say things that she had to admit, hurt her feelings. Daughter of evil, impure schemer, pretender, weakling. Things like that. But the ones that hurt her the most were the references to the relationship between her and her father, mostly because that was the only statement that was true, something that she could not make a rebuttal against. The resentment she had towards her father only continued to grow. Noticing Eliana's plummeting mood, Chad had to prevent himself from gritting his teeth and glaring at Nine Flame. It was not her fault that what she said had inevitably hurt Eliana's feelings. He said that over and over again in his mind before he felt the fire within him calming once more. Taking a glance at Eliana, he noticed that she had raised her head again with a somewhat indifferent face, and secretly sighed. Good girl, he thought. If she wanted to be a true queen and not rely on him, then she needed to be strong in both mind and body, possessing a will that burned for all to awe. But he swore, each and every time she was hurt, he felt it with 2 times the effect. He could only hope that by the time Eliana became the queen that she wanted to be, he would still be in one piece. Reluctantly returning his attention to the Nine-Flame Queen, who was looking at him with a worsening mood that he, at this point, could not care less about, he spoke out with a pensive tone. That person is not my brother, but you are right. I too have noticed the similarities in their auras. They both somehow give off the vibe of both a beast and a monster, quite similar to you actually. The Nine-Flame Queen's eyes narrowed even further. At this point, she was going to end up closing them all together. But it's more than that. Something intrinsic to their mana is so much higher in quality than yours, or anyone else's I've seen. Then his eyes widened as a thought struck him. Anyone apart from the so-called dragon goddess, that is. You mean? That's right. That bastard may have become something similar to a god, Chad said with a bit of a growl in his voice. This is all speculation. We need answers. Don't make such ridiculous assumptions before then. The Nine-Flame Queen said with a huff before returning her attention to the sky, but both rulers of the Phoenix race noticed that her luscious tan skin had paled. They weren't much better either. As the 3 phoenixes below worried, the group of dragons above watched with tight nerves as their goddess approached Eshma's cocoon. The thought of something happening to her had them holding their breaths, even as some of them tried to beat themselves up for even thinking such impossible and blasphemous thoughts. But they couldn't help it. Eshma's aura was too ominous and it was growing by the second. Even all the way in the sky where they had flown to avoid the explosion brought by his sudden evolution, they still felt a peculiar feeling of suppression that caused them to feel helpless. It was terrifying. But neither of them could bring themselves to voice it out loud. They would say things like, the goddess has got this, just watch, or heh, Eshma may be causing a fuss for some reason, but in front of the goddess he's nothing much. And the closest they came to admitting their obvious fear was Eshma's pretty terrifying right now, but there's nothing to worry about with our goddess here. It was quite stupid. Their feeble sense of security stemmed from the fact that Gaia was in front of them, ready to protect them in the case of an emergency, and the thought should have humbled them. But of course they weren't, they were dragons. A domineering race that had suppressed almost all others' races with their sheer might, and on top of that, they were a race, the only race, that had not been created by Eridel, possessing a few traits innate to most biological beings that Eridel had chosen not to add into his created races. How could it be them if they weren't at least a little illogically arrogant? And even as Eridel's avatar sat on a gigantic branch of the Tree of Life, listening intently to the joyful words of his pseudo-daughter Sierra with a benign smile on his face, a portion of his attention was definitely focused on the happenings of Eshma's situation. How could it not? He inwardly laughed at these dragons, but it wasn't too bad. Life was filled with infinite possibilities that could be explored, and the more variables there were, the more chances of a fantastic phenomenon revealing itself there were. It was for this reason why he permitted the existence of a dangerous being like Eshma, even creating a race like the monsters that he had designed to have the specific urge to destroy and kill. It was all for this reason that he soon planned to create the angel race. Only when opposite sides of duality clash can something truly magnificent be found. At least, that was what he thought. "Dad, do you really mean it? I'll find my soulmate someday?" Sierra asked with big shining green eyes. "Of course. I even have a few suspicions of who or what he may be, but this heavenly father of yours doesn't dare to create false expectations." Eridel responded with a pompous nod. "Humph, heavenly father, you're so cringy. Just admit that you created something that got out of your control and you can no longer calculate it." "Daddy, you're a faker." "Ah." Eridel yelped like he had been struck by lightning. Meanwhile, Gaia had finally arrived before Eshma's giant and still-growing cocoon. In fact, it was so big that it had reached the point that Gaia, who was quite big herself being a fourth-realm dragon goddess who was also adept in anatomy refinement, could actually easily stand on it as if it were a stable platform instead of a growing cocoon. And that was what she did. She landed upon the cocoon, gingerly at first because she was not sure if the material was as hard as it looked, but when she slowed the flapping of her wings and slowly disabled the innate technique that most flying beasts had that allowed them to lower their weight when in flight with mana, she realized that the cocoon could easily take her weight, so she folded her wings behind her back and took a comfortable step. But her mood was still grim. She had to act quickly. The best way to enslave someone's soul was when they weren't even conscious enough to form a resistance. Even enslaving a willing soul would form difficulties because it was like trying to poke your own eye. You would instinctively resist. Regardless of your wishes to harm yourself, your body, or rather in this case your soul, would never agree. Only very powerful beings, extremely unique individuals or strange races, would be able to be in complete control of their body or soul, talk less of both. In any case, even if Eshma was awake, he definitely would not be willing to have his soul enslaved. Well, not that he had the mental faculties to actually think like that given his obvious state of madness, but the point still stood. She needed to enslave him before he woke up. After a brief moment of hesitation, she began the activation of the Limitless Soul Brand technique for the first time in both of her lives. This was a very, very special soul enslavement technique that she had practically died to obtain in an inheritance site, even though compared to the other things in that place it could have been considered gum under table. But that was how special the creator of that inheritance was. In fact, she could without shame state that if that person was to have stuck actual gum under the table, so long as he created that gum, she would pick it and chew it for the rest of time. Limitless Soul the Almighty, that was his name, or at least his most used title. He was a being who had not only pioneered soul cultivation, but also a being that had apparently reached the rumored 10th realm in essence cultivation, the limitless realm. Any one of his belongings were priceless treasures that the entire universe would fight for, and she, a mere realm 7 immortal, had obtained one of them. She may have died a short few weeks later because of the relentless pursuit of others, preventing her from capitalizing on any of her gains, but it was still the greatest achievement of her entire life. Gaia funneled her divine soul essence directly into Eshma's soul, something that would have immediately initiated a strong backlash if he were conscious but only caused minor rejections now. Actually, the soul was so complex that even such minor rejections would have caused the plans of most people to fail, but she was not normal at all. At the peak of her previous life she had reached the 48th stage in soul cultivation. Such a cultivation was enough to classify her as a peerless genius in most of the Lole galaxy. Not that she let that fact be known to the public, because that would have resulted in her being coveted to the point of having no choice but to sell her loyalty. Not that that was an entirely bad idea. After all, if she sold her loyalty to the Kong Eternal family, then she would have been able to obtain access to special soul techniques that weren't accessible to the public, preventing her previous situation of having a high soul cultivation but having almost no soul techniques to efficiently utilize it, and granting her a brighter future. She might have even been able to secure at least a pseudo-protection for the Segothia world, which was a wonderful idea. But the plan had flaws and the few risks involved possessed lethal consequences. There were all kinds of strange techniques and abilities all over the universe, and the ability to steal someone's cultivation could be considered elementary level amongst them. If the Kong family had the ability to steal her soul cultivation, the chances that they would choose to do so weren't low at all. They didn't become the strongest family in the galaxy by playing nice with everyone, and they could be just as ruthless as anyone else. Gaia couldn't help but think of these thoughts as she shaped her divine soul essence into the unique sigil that was shown in the Limitless Soul Brand technique. Soul cultivation was very similar to anatomy refinement in the way that they both had no established realms, only endless stages, with the same big boost being gained every multiple of 10, and made the soul stronger in the same way that anatomy refinement made the body stronger. But different from anatomy refinement was that not only was soul refinement much harder to accomplish, but there were also different types of soul energies that could fuel it, similar to essence cultivation. In essence cultivation, mana could be formed by all kinds of energies, including law essence, with each having their own pros and cons. Similarly, soul cultivation, or to be more specific, the very soul itself, could be fueled by different types of soul energy. Only, there weren't nearly as many choices to pick from as there were in essence cultivation. Mental energy was the most basic soul energy. Her soul cultivation was powered by this energy in her past life. But there were others like spirit essence that was mostly exclusive to entities like spirits and ghosts, matrix energy that was generated by extremely unique techniques that converted knowledge, especially that of the mathematical kind, into unique soul energy, magic soul essence which was a sort of fusion essence caused by a special synergy between soul and mana. This, she was now learning, was what Eshma currently had, his soul having the same ruthless properties as his mana. Divine soul essence, which was what she and other gods had, and the most spectacular of them all, primordial essence. Not much was known about primordial essence, and although she had run into a few people that owned it, even getting a feel of it herself from their soul undulations, which was why that she could identify that it was somebody's primordial essence that had aided her in converting her previous laws of destruction into laws of creation, they were all lofty figures that she did not have the hopes of prying information from. In any case, with her new divine soul essence and past life experience, her soul cultivation was bound to experience nothing but success in this life. In fact, despite the fact that she was cultivating all three paths of cultivation, her soul cultivation was already in the 11th stage, which was a phenomenal feat. And although Eshma possessed the illustrious magic soul essence which was on the same level as divine soul essence, or even above, depending on the affiliated mana type, he was only in the first stage of soul cultivation. Nothing compared to her. She weaved the last bits of the soul brand into his soul, which she had also noticed was growing in tandem with his body, and sighed breath of relief. She took a step back to marvel at her work but couldn't help being distracted by the growing size of his soul. Soul size was another aspect of the soul that could aid its cultivation, and a bigger size was equivalent to having a greater foundation, but although it also had the useful feature of increasing the max amount of soul essence, it had the universal flip side of increasing the amount of soul essence needed to upgrade the soul. But still, most people including her believed that the bigger the soul the better, so she was a little envious of Eshma's current condition, but only a little. The price he was paying for this was too big. Gaia sighed, feeling sorry for Eshma's condition. In any case, what was done was done. She could only hope to prevent the same thing from occurring to anyone else and making sure that kept Eshma in control. Perhaps one day he would recover his mind, and she would do almost anything to aid the process if that were possible. Taking one last look at the soul brand and pushing away the small strand of pride that tried to rise in her heart, she withdrew her divine soul essence. Immortals and gods all possessed ridiculous amounts of comprehension, so as long as a technique was explained with the sole purpose of teaching and not trying to hide in a sea of riddles, most immortals/gods would be able to perform the technique on the first go, which was what she had just done, so it wasn't anything to really boast about. But still, to perform a technique created by Limitless Soul the Almighty on the first go? She actually had to suppress her emotions from falling into giddiness despite the grim situation. The technique was extremely straightforward and could be learnt by any other immortal or god just as easily, but still. A limitless soul technique. Limitless, you hear? Limitless. Gaia waited a few moments for her mind to settle before taking off into the air and flying back to the group of dragons. The soul brand had been successfully completed without a hitch, and all that was left now was to activate it whenever she needed to. With this, she would be able to forcefully control Eshma's actions however she pleased, and on top of that, she could even use the soul brand to send his mind into an eternal sleep whilst she still used his soul to control his body. So his madness would not become a problem. But even then, these were only the most minor of all the limitless soul brand's uses. There were quite a few more, and she was very sure that if they had been discovered in her previous life, she would most likely not have had a soul to reincarnate after the grand trouble it would attract inevitably found her. The reason why the limitless soul brand technique had been mostly ignored, allowing her to have the chance to snatch it, was because there were all kinds of soul branding/sealing/enslaving techniques out there in the universe, and there was no reason to be desperate for another, even if it was created by limitless soul, the Almighty himself. But do not be confused, if it weren't for the fact that the bigger factions and unfathomable elites were racing against time to gather the more impressive techniques, they definitely would not have left the limitless soul brand technique behind. After all, it was still a limitless soul technique, even if it was just a soul brand technique, and that could never be looked down upon. So although they were smart enough to realize that not all things were as it seemed, causing them to send some of their weaker forces to fight for the technique and others of its apparent caliber, it had not been enough to deal with her and her other companions. "Ha," she said, not enough, as if many of those companions had not died in the crossfire. Ha! In the end, things had already happened and there was nothing that she could change. But even if she could change the past, she definitely would still have obtained that technique by any means necessary. The only thing she would have liked to change was the number of deaths on her side, but if those numbers were necessary to secure the technique, then so be it, that was their fate. The limitless soul brand technique was just that precious. Yes, it was a technique that was used to brand souls, enslaving them with unique functions that most other techniques did not have. But as said before, that was just its most basic function. Another use was the ability to siphon the energy of the soul that was branded, causing the user's soul cultivation to experience a swift and almost seamless rise. Another use was to actually dual cultivate soul energy between both souls, enhancing them both, but of course, at an understandable lower speed than the previous use. Another use was to flood the branded soul with the user's own soul essence, causing the branded soul to convert into a vessel/avatar soul for the user, without it breaking. And there were more. All of these galaxy-altering abilities had been compacted into a single technique, and she had obtained it. It was like a wondrous yet fleeting dream, but it was real. This was really real. But still, having obtained this technique, she had always been worried about the fortune she must have obtained to do so, and that was a very worrying thought. Everyone who was strong enough knew that fortune was a real thing, and if you monopolized it too greatly without giving back, it would be snatched from you in the most ruthless way possible. So, hoping to balance out her fortune and karma, she had been doing selfless deeds, blessing others' lives and giving back fortune the only way she knew how. It was a very inefficient method, but what else could she do? But then she broke through to the fourth realm, which allowed her to obtain a few surface-level answers about its purpose from the system, and she found out that one of the purposes of the tribulations was to allow the inexplicable concept of fortune to be taken back from herself safely, and return to fate where it had originated from. Wow! Just wow! Who would have thought that? TSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSS in the vicinity. And at the same time, thanks to the soul brand, Gaia noticed immediately that Eshma had abruptly woken up. CH. 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 As the repetitive sound of something cracking tore into the air, it became very clear to Gaia and the others that Eshma's evolution was coming to an end. Cracks could be seen ripping into existence all over Eshma's cocoon, and each of the gaps released smoke that was an ominous two-toned red color, and it hissed into existence with an unmistakable nefarious quality that sent a shiver down the spine of everyone who witnessed it. Everyone except the golden dragoness in front, who watched with narrowed eyes. System, she called out inwardly. What kind of beast has Eshma become? The being known as Eshma has evolved into the beast species, celestial dragon of ruination. Gaia was stunned for a moment, but she soon regained her bearing as a question emerged in her mind. What a domineering name. But I was half expecting you to ignore me again. Does his quality of being not exceed mine? Or has he become something unique to this world that all gods are allowed to learn of, like the 7 deadly sins? Wrong. Gaia waited for a bit, not without feeling uncomfortable knowing that Eshma's quality of being had surpassed hers, before realizing that the system was not going to elaborate on its own. So why am I allowed to know the name of his species, even to some extent the grade of his species? Also, why actually tell me the grade if the most important part of it is censored? The being known as Eshma has entered a master and slave pact with the host, thus allowing all of his information to be accessible. The species of the being known as Eshma has evolved into a realm that the system cannot comprehend. The only information accessible is that it is not complete, only pseudo. Gaia was stunned once again. Is it above the law, beasts? Undoubtedly. Gaia felt her blood cool. What on Segothia has Eshma become? Something above a law beast. She couldn't even imagine it. What could possibly be above the laws? Even the three limitless beings that her galaxy had been lucky enough to learn about had powers that were based on the laws. Limitless Soul the Almighty, the most high-profile one of them all, was famous for the soul laws that he pioneered. Endless Darkness the Friend, also known as the Darkest One and the Friend of the Abyss, a mysterious but still universally renowned being, was most famous for his darkness laws and his abnormal connection to the Abyss. And finally, Eternal Light the Sovereign, or Sovereign Eternal Light, obviously known for taking the laws of light to its highest possible stage. Of course, these beings naturally had other laws and intents that they specialized in, some that they probably fused with their main laws, but they were still just that. Laws and intents or an amalgamation of them. That, still did not surpass the laws. But perhaps she was wrong. No, she was definitely wrong. It was completely impossible that Eshma, an insignificant beast in the grand scheme of things, would chance upon a power that was allegedly above the laws, when the 10th realm beings did not have it. It was either that they had it, or perhaps something even greater than that, and she had just discovered something unbelievably precious that would give her insight onto the path to becoming a limitless being, or nobody had it and what the system was telling her was its own misunderstanding brought by cluelessness. Gaia's heart rate was disturbed as she thought about these things, her eyes sparkling with wonder. But soon, her attention was dragged back to the main attraction. Cha! All at once, the cocoon surrounding Eshma's body shattered apart with a loud sound that was soon followed by a whooshing sound as the two-toned red smoke was fully released into the atmosphere. All other sounds had been silenced, and it sent the hearts of the viewing dragons into their throats. Even the lesser dragons far below, the three legendary birds gazing from a distance on a lonely hill, the ignorant beasts that crawled the forest and the weakest of all humans that shambled as they did their duties, were swallowed by silence as fear that they did not know the origin of clutched their hearts. All sounds apart from the whooshing smoke far above, which they definitely should not have been able to hear from their distance, had been devoured, and even colors seemed to dull. The humans shivered and fell to the ground with some even passing out, the beasts in the forest prostrated themselves with quaking bones, the legendary birds on the hill wore grim and pale faces, and the lesser dragons in their caves all looked up at the source with shock, feeling an unnatural connection to the pandemonium above. But one of those lesser dragons, one with ordinary gray scales that spoke of a lack of specific affinity, yet unnatural neon green eyes that even slightly lit up his cave, felt a little more than just shock and fear. He seemed to be feeling hostility? He didn't quite know himself, but something about the thing above made him feel tight. He clawed the ground a little to give relief to the growing violent feelings in his heart, but it barely worked. He had only felt this a few times before, and each of those times was when he encountered one of those strange creatures that had a strange black marking on their head. The gluttonous pricks that only knew how to eat until they died. But how could one of those fiends be at the most sacred place of their dragon mountain? It just wasn't possible, especially with the presence of their goddess. Just what Theodore began to think, but he was swiftly interrupted. Roar! A world-shaking roar tore through the silence with the impact of a collapsing star, sending waves of shockwaves that instantly knocked out everyone below the 4th realm, including the realm 3 Phoenix Aliana, neither 9 Flame Queen of Phoenix King able to help her. Up above, the elder dragons weren't faring well either. Only the supreme dragons along with their king and goddess were able to cope without suffering, but all of them apart from their goddess felt complete and utter terror. And that was because with the roar that summoned wild winds and shook the entire forest, the smoke had dispersed enough to allow his body to be seen. And what a terrifying body it was. Glossy scales that were a mixture of dark and light red that shimmered as he moved, neon red runes that ravaged the senses patterning his body, 6 eyes of the same neon red with no other color to be found, 4 pitch-black horns swirling with 2-toned red lights, 6 legs, 4 wings, and spikes that were similar to his horns trailing down his neck to the tip of his tail. And then there was the size. A terrifying, heart-palpitating height of 700 meters and a length of over 1,000. What the heck was this existence? The aura Eshma released put a new scope on what it meant to be evil. The desire for destruction and the end of all things was so palpable that the Crystal Dragon King felt like if he stuck his tongue out, he would experience how it felt to taste an emotion for the first time. He needs to die. A single thought occurred simultaneously in the minds of many of the dragons, the thought feeling nigh rebellious because of the urge to submit that Eshma's all-out peak dragon aura caused them, but their instinctual reaction to eliminate a threat was much stronger, especially when those 6 terrifying eyes gained a semblance of intelligence and locked onto them. Without pause, as soon as Eshma detected them, he opened his mighty jaws that looked like they could split them apart with a single bite, and began to send energy into his mouth, causing a ball of red light to emerge that got brighter the more energy was sent into it. Clearly, it was a breath attack. The Crystal Dragon King felt his throat constrict with fear. He wanted to tell everyone to run, but before could even complete the word. He wanted to tell everyone to run, but before could even complete the word, there was another abrupt change in the situation. Gaia, their golden goddess, flew above before imposingly stretching out her brilliant wings and yelling out a demand with a single word. Yield. And like her voice was magic itself, Eshma's gigantic eyes that could easily be seen from their distance flashed with a golden light and he suddenly froze, his breath attack fading into nothing as if he had lost consciousness mid-attack. Wadash. Not giving anyone time to think, Eshma's oppressive sky-covering wings that had just been spread out to its limits, casting a shadow over the mountain, folded behind his back with a snap. He then crouched down the lowest his body could go and bowed his head. Was he prostrating himself? The Crystal Dragon King looked at all of this with wild eyes, his chest still heaving as if he had just flown 1,000 miles non-stop. His carefully crafted composure completely collapsed. What just happened? He thought with the most densest confusion he had ever experienced in his entire life. And wait a minute, was it just him, or had the faintly distinguishable intelligence in Eshma's eyes, that he had just gained, disappeared? They looked a little duller and lacked the keen intent to raise everything to the ground that had almost held him ensnared. He blinked. Once, twice, and then slowly turned his head to what was no doubt the course of this stupendous change in the situation. But even with his intentions to keep his movements slow, steady and measured, his neck still twitched and his wings still jittered. A result of the absurd amounts of adrenaline he still had rushing through his veins and the phantom urge to flee that had not completely dissipated. But he managed the movement nonetheless, and there she was. The most beautiful dragoness he had ever seen, floating steadily in all her magisterial and shining glory. He was stunned. Completely. But, in that moment, he knew what he had to do. He looked at the impossibly docile Eshma, whose ocean-like aura was receding like the tide, and then to his fellow dragons who were either looking at the goddess or the abomination, with looks of shock that he was sure he was mirroring himself. But he knew what he had to do. Summoning confidence from who knows where, he yelled out with his loudest voice. The heavenly goddess has saved us once again. My fellow dragons, let your hearts ignite and praise her holy name. Long live the goddess! Long live the goddess! Long live the goddess! Many faces were startled back into reality, but soon a chant had begun. Long live the goddess! Long live the goddess! Long live the goddess! Eventually, even the dragons below could hear it and began to pick up the chant, and like that, it didn't take long for the entire forest to shake with the name of their goddess. Zeal and pure adoration zinged through the Crystal Dragon King's body as he stared at the imposing figure of his golden goddess, his mind replaying the scene of a single word causing the berserk Eshma to submit. How powerful! How beautiful! How dignified! Indeed, only a being like this could be a goddess. The goddess of all creation. His eyes shone and shivered with emotion. Gaia almost rolled her eyes at the zealous praise of her people, but she had to admit, it did feel good. In her past life, she had been a rather introverted individual, even for her kind, immortals, that would sometimes spend centuries or even millennia in seclusion. So she had never experienced praise like this before. Of course, there were times that she would save a large group of people and they would praise her, but that was different. Not only would they have praised anyone else who saved them like she did, making it less personal and more of a transactional service, but the praises were certainly not as resounding as this one. So this is how it feels to be a god, huh? Not bad, Gaia thought with amusement. She turned around to turn them to calm down, but just as she was about to do so, her peripheral vision caught the sight of what seemed to be a white humanoid figure, hovering in the distance. So naturally she turned back to look at it, but when she identified who it was her pupils constricted greatly. White robes, long white hair, unforgettable golden eyes. It wasn't easy to see from this distance and she was just barely able to make out the being's features, even with all 3 of her cultivation paths boosting her eyesight, but these were features that she would never forget nor mistake for anything else. And she had a feeling the man knew that, seeing as he was close enough for her to detect but too far for anyone else. Who else could it be, if not the man that turned her into a goddess, Eridel? Gaia frowned for a moment, but she made a decision very quickly. The only decision, really. She turned around once more and began to speak to her people. Everybody. The chanting ceased immediately. Well, at least the chanting of the dragons who were with her. The dragons below were still shouting "Long live the goddess," but it was fine since it wasn't their attention that she was trying to grab. She paused for a moment anyway before continuing. Everyone, the crisis that has befallen Eshma has been averted. She could practically see the dragons holding back from praising her all over again, their eyes shining with barely restrained excitement. Unfortunately, his ailment has caused him to lose his mind, so in order to prevent him from causing further harm I had to forcefully take control of him, but eventually, his mind will be restored to what it was and the Eshma you know will be back, this I promise you. That last promise was more for Calmilla. She wasn't here to hear it right now since she wasn't in the fourth realm and wasn't allowed to come for her safety, but she was still a close individual to Eshma, the closest other than her, and she would hear of the promise when the dragons went back. For now, I want all of you to return. I have some things to do, but I don't want to hear any of you saying bad things about Eshma when I come back. What has happened to him is a tragedy and he should not be flamed for it. Go now. She could see some of them wince at the dismissal, including the Dragon King, but they listened to her without hesitation. Take care, great goddess. The Dragon King said with a bow, then he turned around and said, let's go. Before they all flew down, ignoring the 15 peaks that were almost completely occupied by the giant figure of Eshma, and disappearing into the distance. Only when minutes passed and their presences had all disappeared, did a flash of golden light appear from her side, along with a very familiar sensual voice. Well, if it isn't Miss Gaia. How wonderful it is to see you. Ah, but as exhilarated as I am to see you honest. I must quickly advise you to get rid of that smoke. Your people will all die if it descends any further. Gaia turned around and there he was. Unnatural golden eyes surrounded by endless whites. White hair, white skin, white robes. And then all of that surrounded by a soft golden aura as if he was a deity from the heaven's supreme region. He really did look like them. Those damnable dogs. All deities had a permanent golden aura that surrounded their bodies. It was probably tied to the fact they all had extreme affinities with the element/laws of light. Not that that meant that their affinities were exclusive to light. She of all people would know. She forcefully shut down the memories of those harrowing days and focused on the man before her. Honestly, he wasn't the most handsome man that she had ever seen. After all, in just the small galaxy alone, there existed races, bloodlines, physiques and even techniques that made the owner impossibly appealing. Some of the more devious kinds even had the ability to forcefully raise arousal, and she had met them. Compared to them, although this man that called himself Eridel possessed looks that were far above the level of mortals and even standard immortals, it was nothing much. But still, there was something about his eyes and his voice that exuded boundless charm, so much so that it even held her enthralled. And he wasn't even using his laws of sound to aid him like he did the first time they met. She was only dazed for a short moment though. It didn't take longer than a second for her to extract herself from that state, and soon her eyes widened when she comprehended what he said. Your people will all die if it descends any further. The ominous red smoke that Eshma had released when he completed his evolution. Of course it was dangerous. Gaia felt like an idiot. Remembering how the explosion caused by his first evolution caused many dragons to disintegrate to the point that only scales and bones were left, Gaia became a little worried. But when she turned to look at it she became a little confused. The feeling that the smoke gave off was deeply ominous and terrifying, this she already knew. But what was raised to attention was that although the smoke gave off a very scary feeling, it didn't strike her senses as something innately dangerous. It felt more like an aura. An aura could give off many kinds of feelings, happy, sad, aggressive, scary, whatever. But most of the time it could never hurt anybody. It could possibly influence the emotions of others, but that was the greatest extent of most auras. And that was how the red smoke felt right now. Lethal, dangerous, oppressive. But harmless. But how could this be possible? If even Eridel was telling her about it, then it definitely possessed the ability to cause harm. How was it hiding? If the two laws that created this new existence were anything to go by, then they should not be containing stealth abilities, so what was going on? Could it be that its capability to cause harm was not something that she could comprehend? Was this thing called ruination completely beyond her scope of understanding? Many thoughts were being generated in her mind, but she didn't have a lot of time to waste. She didn't want the smoke to delve any deeper. So without any more hesitation, she gave Eshma an order through the new mental link formed by the soul brand. Equals Eshma, get rid of that smoke, equals. Immediately, Eshma lifted himself up from his prostrating position, causing barely audible sounds of creaking that Gaia suspected were coming from his gigantic muscles, and the sound of wind as his humongous body tore through the wind barrier. The former was more impressive because it spoke of how dense his muscles were, but the latter was only natural. For him to move with that big body of his and look like he was operating at the same speed as a regular dragon could only mean that he was actually moving extremely quickly. After all, for a normal dragon in the fourth realm to lift their wings to its highest point from the lowest point, it would have to cross a distance of around 80 to 100 meters, but for Eshma that distance was multiplied by at least 10 times. And yet he still crossed that distance in the same time frame that it took for a regular dragon to complete the same movement. Essentially 1,000 meters in 2 or so seconds. Of course he was tearing through the wind barrier. A normal dragon was still quite big and could of course produce the same sound, but they could only achieve that by moving at their maximum speed, or close. As for Eshma, it looked like almost any random movement from him would kick up the wind. So it went without saying that as he lifted up his chest and tilted up his head, flaring his wings out a little to steady his balance as he exhaled an almost visible breath of air, his 6 glowing eyes and gleaming teeth easily visible through the smoke, it formed quite the sight. WFFFFFFFF. Eshma began drawing air into his lungs very audibly, and instantly, the lazily descending smoke stopped its aimless movement, instead changing direction and collectively moving towards the vacuum that was Eshma's mouth and disappearing inside. This continued on for about 50 seconds before it came to a stop and all the smoke had disappeared completely. As Eshma settled back down once more, his entire body glowing a little as if he had just received some magical nourishment, Gaia couldn't help but think that he had indeed become incredibly daunting. She'd be very, very worried if she didn't have the ability to control him. She couldn't even give herself a guarantee that she could kill him even if she was forced to do so, and that was even with the special techniques that she knew of. Thankfully, she had the limitless soul brand and his life was now hers to dictate. If she wanted him dead, it would take nothing more than a single thought. Hopefully, that would never happen and her desire to restore Eshma's mind would come to fruition. Excellent, excellent, came the voice of the golden-eyed abnormality. Gaia turned to face him and saw him rubbing his hands together like a devious businessman. Now that that's over with, it's time to get to the main topic of my visit. Care to chat with me? Gaia felt a little apprehensive. What were the chances that right after using an unparalleled technique that the whole universe would drool for, a being like Eridel would appear right before her? It was suspicious. Way too suspicious. But what could she do? The power of a goddess was something granted to her by him, and she even had suspicions that the primordial essence that she used to become a creation dragon rather than a destruction dragon all those years ago was also something granted by him. After all, other than him, she hadn't so much as seen another immortal, talk less of a being that could generate primordial essence. But even if both of those things were false, the fact that Eridel was much stronger than her still remained. She could practically feel the strength hidden beneath his skin like waves of radiation beating across her scales. It was horrifying. If Eridel really knew about her limitless soul brand and came here to obtain the technique manual, she could not resist. It was very likely that her own life would be held hostage, and it would perish if she refused him, and considering the fact that she no longer had the means to undergo another reincarnation with intact memories, she would really have to cough up the technique just to preserve her life. But what was to say that he wouldn't kill her anyway? Who could bear the existence of another being with a limitless soul technique when you could easily kill them and become the sole owner? Gaia's blood cooled as she thought of these things, but she didn't lose her mind. She had been in many dangerous situations throughout the long duration of her previous life and would not crumble until she exhausted all of her options. No, even then she would not crumble. Even if she had nothing left to give, she would never allow her mind to collapse. That was the dignity of an immortal. She began to concoct a plan. At this point, it was pretty much certain that Eridel was here for the technique. The coincidence was too big for that not to be so. She would definitely have to teach him the technique to prevent a bad outcome. But how would she preserve her life in the event that he decided to off her? Could she poison the technique? No. Too many chances of failure, not to mention he might even kill her before he later learnt that the technique had been sabotaged and needed her for the cure. Could she somehow pretend that the forces in Segothia knew of her existence here and would retaliate if she were killed? Likely but not foolproof. Moreover, he had already expressed his disdain for this entire galaxy, talk less of a single law world in its worst region. So how about a contract? Could she force one? The value of a limitless soul technique did not need to be expressed. Surely he would be willing to accept a contract that prevented him from harming her if she willingly gave the full technique without hiding or altering parts of it. He wouldn't gain anything if he killed her just for refusing, so it was very likely. But what if he could just read her mind and search for the technique without her consent? How would wait? Earlier he had said care for a chat. If he had the kind of ability to search minds or souls, would he need to care about conversation? The allure of a limitless soul technique would surely make that unlikely. Also, in regards to him making her a goddess, she would be a fool if she believed that it was solely to obtain her knowledge on this galaxy. He also mentioned back then that he wanted her to be a partner of his. Most likely a subordinate. He definitely had plans for her. So would he be willing to kill her when he could accept a harmless contract? Likely, very likely. Although the thought of him using the method of fattening a sheep only to consume it later was something she had thought about many times before, perhaps she could still include a clause in the contract to prevent him from killing her, then she would be safe from both three. But what if he felt pressured and knew he couldn't agree for the sake of his future plans, causing him to? Gaia's brain burned through energy as it forced itself to come up with a method to ensure survival. She didn't know it, but at that moment, her eyes began to visibly glow a little brighter. A result brought by her will flame, at the center of her mindscape, burning more vigorously than normal. However, seeing as she hadn't responded to Eridel's question, he decided to speak up once more, but not without a devious glint in his eyes that Gaia caught when his voice snatched her attention, making her even more wary. Dear Goddess Gaia, your silence pains me so. But no matter. I'm sure you have a lot on your mind after such harrowing events. Poor Eshma, he said with mock sympathy on his face. Alas! He clapped his hands together. Time waits for no one. So with that being said, I would like you to help me out with something. A slow grind spread across his face. You see, it's come to my attention that, he took a pause again, his eyes twinkling as he delighted in her discomfort. This bastard. Gain inwardly growled. Just say it and get it over with. That you are the perfect person to deal with a problem I've been hoping to get rid of. Would you like to hear about it? What? Gaia blinked at the unexpected words. What are you talking about? She spoke out loud, her voice as steady as always as if her mind wasn't in turmoil. I'm sure you've heard about them. Those unruly punks. The 7 deadly sins. If Gaia had eyebrows to raise right now, they would be raised quite high. What the heck is going on? They've been causing quite a few problems for me and I want them all gone. I'm sure you feel the same after the terrible peril that befell Eshma, so how about it? Are you willing to listen? Gaia was stunned. This entire time, she had been so sure that Eridel was after her technique and had been furiously scheming for the best way out, but this was what he wanted to talk about? Now of all times? Was this a joke? Was he stalling for fun, knowing that he could obtain the technique at any time, or did he really have no desire to obtain the limitless soul brand? There was no way he didn't know about it, the timing of his arrival was still too coincidental. Even if he wasn't aware that it was a limitless grade technique, there was no way he couldn't tell how special it was. But instead of trying to obtain it, he wanted to talk about the sins? Something was clearly wrong, but what could she do? There was no way she would dare to mention the technique first. Instead, it was best to fully engage in this unexpected turn of events. I'm listening. She spoke out, answering his question. Good. It would have been very saddening if you weren't, he said dramatically. Gaia just stared at him. She was not in the mood to entertain his theatrics at all. Thankfully, all he did was sigh before continuing. Now I'm sure you're aware of the sins and the great evil that they represent, but I think that you have greatly underestimated their innate might and growth rate. Otherwise you'd be running across the world with the golden birdie below, looking for all the help you can get. Gaia's heart rate picked up. Are the 3 sins seriously so strong that the entire world needs to unite to defeat them? That was quite the preposterous thought. Especially since magic had only been introduced to this world a little over a century ago. How could such a world-class threat already exist? Well, gluttony and wrath need their time. But envy? Yes. If not dealt with swiftly, the entire world really would have to unite just to survive. Then But since you and everyone else are incapable of stopping him at the moment, it would be wise to start looking for help in the other continents. Time waits for no one after all. He repeated with a broad smile on his face, as if he wasn't talking about the possible end of this world. Gaia was silent for a while before she spoke again. Why is this world so strange? Eridel kept smiling. Whatever, she wasn't expecting an answer anyway. I'm sure you're not here just to talk. What method do you have that can deal with the sins? She didn't bother to ask him why he couldn't deal with the sins himself. She'd witnessed too many scenarios that prevented people who were overly strong, like gods, from interfering in worldly affairs. Besides, even if he could intervene, she really doubted that he'd tell her the honest truth. It was really quite tedious. I thought you would never ask, now listen closely. 5 minutes later, Eridel had left. And not once had he mentioned the soul brand technique. Skies of Iridius. Currently, Eridel was cruising through the skies on his way to his next destination using his favorite form of transport, a soft and fluffy cloud. He was laying on his side with his head resting on his hand, and using the other hand, he tossed a strawberry into his mouth and began to chew. It wasn't the first time he had eaten since the creation of this avatar, but it was still something he did very rarely, mostly because he didn't need to. But every time that he did so he found it quite enjoyable. Unfortunately, this time, his mind was occupied with other thoughts, with the abnormal technique that Gaia had used being at the forefront. Of course he had noticed it. Although he didn't know the depths of its secrets, he could tell that it was a very special soul branding technique. The memories that he had inherited from the golden orb possessed very few techniques, but all of them were galaxy-shaking. The evolutionary blood beast technique, for example, was one of them. Actually, the EBB technique that he had passed on to the beast as an innate skill had been incredibly weakened. There were many limits in that technique that the true technique did not have, and it was because he had many supreme techniques like this, provided to him by the golden orb, that he had been able to come to his own understanding of the various laws which inevitably helped him create all kinds of miraculous things, like the monster race. Of course, the fact that he was an actual planet and had affinity with all laws also helped, but that was besides the point. The point was that even with all of this knowledge and innate mental talent, he could not comprehend the runes on the soul brand that Gaia had used. Eridel had a wealth of knowledge that could make countless immortals like her lose control of themselves. But out of nowhere she had suddenly produced something like that? And with such relative ease too? How could it possibly not attract his attention? So without hesitation, he decided to speed up his plans in regards to the 7 deadly sins. Also that he could converse with Gaia and see how she reacted to his presence. It wasn't enough to watch with just his planetary vision, since he couldn't, or rather wouldn't, communicate with her that way. And no amount of looking would allow him to learn about the technique, so he had decided to conduct a test. Her reaction to his appearance had been quite telling. She already knew that he was far above her scope, which should mean that there was a chance that he knew of her technique or perhaps had better ones. But her reaction proved that she definitely knew that he didn't have a technique like that, or possibly had them in very sparse amounts, and that it was likely that he would do anything to obtain it. The first time he had met her, he had appeared with the persona of someone who considered a galaxy like this a bathroom. A complete waste, so to speak. Which implied that his background was very, very high. And yet, she still believed without any hesitation, that he would harm her or ever worse, just for the technique. This meant 2 things. 1, that the grade of this technique was at the pinnacle, whatever the pinnacle was. And 2, that she knew that very, very well. Interesting. In the end, he hadn't spoken about it, opting to be nonchalant for the sake of relations. But he would be watching the interactions between her and Eshma very closely. He might not have access to Gaia's soul, but he did have access to Eshma's. If he saw something that he decided he needed, then he would. Well, it was pretty obvious. Central Continent, Holy Land of Snakes. 2 weeks later. The Holy Land of Snakes was famed for various reasons, some being its geographical location, the center of the Central Continent, the unnatural size and lusciousness of its organic resources, and the fact that it was an actual sacred land, filled with bountiful resources and laden with magical energy. But these facts actually paled in comparison to the knowledge that this land was home to the most powerful entity on the continent, Yorma the Devourer, along with the rest of her snake brethren. And as the name suggested, normally, only snakes could be found on this land, with the exception of human slaves that most powerful beast factions owned, and on occasion, the divine dragons which could be considered their distant cousins. But today, for the first time in history, a grand meeting was taking place within this land with all the most powerful races on the continent invited. Giant snakes, blazing birds, winged dragons and serpentine dragons, icy-furred deer, long-eared elves, large-eared celestial elephant beastkin, golden monkeys and more. These amazing creatures were blazing with their natural auras and created a heart-palpitating sight that would shock anyone. But despite that, they were not the main attraction. That achievement went to the humongous figures of the celestial beasts, Apis the elephant and Jungo the monkey king, along with Yorma, whose massive size wasn't much inferior. It had come as a shock to the entire continent when it was revealed that Yorma wasn't actually a celestial beast, instead being an enlightened beast who had only reached that size thanks to her prodigious bloodline, especially since that meant that she had an enlightened form, something that no one had ever seen. That would also make her like Gaia, the dragon goddess, since no one had ever seen her enlightened form either. But on the topic of enlightened forms, although almost every being here was in the fourth realm and almost all beasts, nobody was using their enlightened form. Some would think that it would be a good idea to use them since it would work as a flex, proving to everyone what realm they were in, but nobody was willing to do that here. Everybody here had gone through the fires of war many times, causing them to become wary and cautious. So to come to a place like this and not be in their most optimal state for battle in case anything went wrong was simply foolish. In any case, this allowed the dignity and might of their true forms to be seen, and some of them weren't much less eye-catching than the three humongous beasts. Reiko the Beast Emperor of the East, a continent-renowned figure known for his impressive might and dazzling looks. His impossibly golden fur and pure white underbelly, distinct from any other tiger and daunting height of 100 m tall, which was comparable to the Crystal Dragon King despite the vast difference in the innate size of their species, no doubt thanks to his great achievement in anatomy refinement, made him a sight nobody could ignore. Dodo the Guardian of the Dawn Forest and progenitor of the Glacial Saint Deer clan, an impressive sight with luminous white fur and icy antlers and hooves that perpetually let out a cool mist. Although he was smaller than Reiko, he was no less dazzling and certainly not weaker. Gaia could naturally not be ignored with her brilliant scales of gold, height of 130+ meters and divine aura. The Crystal Dragon King was also a sight, Draco the Divine Dragon King, Lily the Enchanting White Snake, Hicula the Four-Headed Poisonous Snake, the Nine-Flame Queen and the two rulers of the Phoenix race, even the Elven Queen with her prominent beauty in unique colors, especially considering she was wearing clothes, a novelty that most of those outside of the Dawn Forest were unaware of. The fact that she was so much smaller than the other hegemons meant almost nothing, all of them were startling sights to behold. But of course, not everyone here was a friend. For starters, the tensions between the two kinds of dragons were almost a tangible thing. Gaia was naturally indifferent, but the two respective kings were glaring at each other as if they would strike out at any moment. Too much blood had been shed between them and reconciliation seemed impossible, and if it weren't for the fact that they were surrounded by many other predators, some who were more powerful than they, then they definitely would have fought as soon as they laid eyes on each other. Grand Continental Meeting be damned. There also seemed to be some tension between the elves and the golden monkeys from the north, but nobody there was surprised. Something happened a few years ago which resulted in a feud of sorts, and ever since then, news that a golden monkey had killed an important elf or an elf had killed an important golden monkey could be heard from time to time. Not that they knew why. But going by the leering gazes and obscene wagging tongues from the monkeys, as well as the frosty resentful looks from the elves, it wasn't that hard to take a guess or two. There were other pseudo-confrontations taking place in the gathering as everyone waited for the last few groups to arrive, but for the most part, there was no confrontation as heated as the between the two species of dragons. But it wasn't all bad. Some groups were merry with each other, especially those that came from the same region, of course, that's if they were allies and not contesting for resources in said region, and there were even specific individuals that seemed to be exceptionally popular. Reiko the Beast Emperor, for example, appeared to attract more conversations and smiles from people than even Gaia. Sure, a big part of that was because the latter was extremely aloof and didn't mingle much outside the true dragon race, in contrast to the former who had journeyed far and wide, making allies and enemies all over the place, but it was still a great feat. The Elf Queen was another person who was exceptionally popular in the gathering. She was passionately conversing with others who seemed to be absorbed by what she was saying and didn't look at all bothered by the gazes from the golden monkeys. Queen Titania, came a feminine voice from above. The alluring and mesmerizing yet deep voice immediately caused most of the other conversations to cease. Titania looked up and caught the gaze of Yorma, all three crimson eyes trained on her own. She was a little intimidated but didn't let it show on her face, keeping up her soulful smile. But what the giant snake said next caused her lips to involuntarily twitch. I too am interested in these clothes. You really intend to start selling them? She's interested? Huh? Why? Titania thought in bewilderment. It wasn't secret knowledge that Yorma never used her enlightened form. The enlightened form provided many benefits for beasts, but the most important one of them all was the ability to absorb magical energy from the air for their own use. This could only be done in the enlightened form and wouldn't work if a beast transformed back into their true form, so normally, by Yorma completely ignoring her enlightened form, what she was doing should be crippling her advancement speed, utter stupidity. But how could Yorma, the publicly known strongest creature on the continent, be stupid when it came to cultivation? Rubbish! In actuality, because of her sky-devouring bloodline, whether she was in her enlightened form or not, she would be able to swallow ambient magical energy like she was inhaling air, an ability that caused every beast to go green with envy. But there was a limit to this ability, and that limit was essentially the size of her mouth and throat. See where this is going? Yorma in her natural form had a very, very big mouth. But her enlightened form would be restricted to the size of a regular human's, and contrary to popular belief, snakes do not and cannot unhinge their jaws to open their mouths wider, so she wouldn't even have that as a species benefit being something like flexible bones for a snake or wings on the back for birds, so naturally, she wouldn't be able to swallow as much magical energy. If she were to use her enlightened form to cultivate like others, she would actually be slowing down her cultivation speed. It made perfect sense that nobody had seen her enlightened form. So with all that being said, why oh why would she ever be interested in clothes? They would never be able to fit her large body, impossible. The clothes her people made were made for the usage of normal-sized enlightened races, humans, elves, etc. Putting in more effort for the elephant beastkin whose adults were 3.6 meters tall on average was definitely doable, but Yorma? A colossal-sized snake? Ha! Titania briefly saw the image of a huge black snake wrapped in cloth and her lips twitched. No way! She definitely wanted clothes for her enlightened form, but why? Wait, maybe it was for someone else? Either way, she had to speak before things became awkward. But she wasn't embarrassed by the fact that she had been stunned, others were definitely thinking the same things as her. It is true, Queen Yorma. Do you wish to use them yourself? She asked. A question that was on everyone's minds. And what if I do? Yorma replied with a peculiar light in her eyes. No problem at all. It's just, as you can probably guess, we can only shape clothes for the enlightened. Do you want the clothes for someone else, or? She was probably being a little too nosy but she really wanted to know. Humph, Yorma harumphed in apparent dissatisfaction. You elves really like to dance around subjects. Just be honest, you want to know if I have use for an enlightened form, right? Titania gave a slow nod. With the introduction of certain politics in the Elven Kingdom, it was natural that those who intended to utilize it or hide from it became more imaginative with their words. She wasn't ashamed of the way she spoke at all as it had provided her many benefits in conversations with other rulers, but she was a little peeved at the open disrespect. However, what could she do? It was rare for the way she spoke to be identified, much less called out, but it wasn't the first time and it wouldn't be the last. Such a thing could only be expected from Yorma the Devourer, the strongest entity on the continent. The pathway to power was filled with knowledge and the Devourer had definitely traveled it the furthest. Well, at least that was what she thought until she saw the Nine-Flame Queen. When she had arrived, she hadn't made an attempt to hide her aura at all and instead flared it for all to see, and it was definitely not inferior to that of Yorma's, which was quite the shock, even if she had been informed beforehand. She quickly glanced at the flaming bird before returning her attention to the giant snake, where she caught her rolling her large eyes. How could it be possible for me to never use my enlightened form? I refuse to believe that it's completely useless to me. Sooner or later I will need it, and when that happens I would like clothes to cover my nakedness. Nobody is worthy of mating with me and thus, nobody is worthy of the sight of my reproductive organs. Complete silence spread across the gathering as all conversation ceased. Nobody is worthy. The statement resounded through their heads like a mighty slap. What arrogance! Nobody is worthy of seeing your body? Of all the males on the continent, nobody was worthy. Of course, they understood the sentiment. By now, greater importance had been placed on the various erogenous zones of a biological body, and it had recently become disrespectful for a stranger to stare at them for extended periods of time without permission. At the very least, you were expected to give a compliment if you took the liberty. But sometimes, no matter how nicely you did it, if you were weaker you could be killed for it. This was especially prevalent in the dragon race, particularly when looking at their females. Nobody knew why their attitude towards relationships were so different and why their two different genders seemed to have such a predictable mentality, with one being mostly dominant and the other submissive, but that's just how it was. But to bring things back full circle, they understood the sentiment of a powerful person like Yorma wanting to cover up her naked body. Most of them agreed that it was a tad bit inappropriate that the reproductive organs of a ruler can be so easily gazed upon and fantasized, but to go ahead and say that nobody was worthy of mating with you? In front of so many great kings and emperors that lorded over entire races? How could they not feel the phantom slap? But what's worse was that there was nothing that they could do about it. They were really all weaker. Even the only other person in the vicinity who was on par with Yorma's might was also a female, so they couldn't even say something like, "What about so-and-so," to get at least a little get back. Not to mention that this meant that the number 3 strongest people they knew of were now all female. Yorma, 9 Flame Queen, and of course, the dragon goddess, Gaia. What kind of joke was this? Where were the male gods? Where were the male supremes? Titania and a few of the other females in the gathering found themselves nodding. What Yorma said made sense. Almost everyone here was in the 4th realm, with some even being rulers of entire races or even groups of races, so naturally, they were all proud. Although they wouldn't dare to go as far as to say nobody was worthy of mating with me, the people who were worthy were so few in number that they could be considered less than 5% of the continent's population. When they were young, they had been pleased by the lustful attentions, finding the fact that they were desirable prospects for mating a wonderful feeling, but once again, they were all the most powerful figures in the continent, and that meant that most of them were first-generation life forms, creatures that were even older than magical energy itself, which made them 172 years old, not counting the first-generation elves that spawn every month. In other words, they were old and had become immune to such juvenile pleasures. Nowadays, they were becoming increasingly discontent with the lustful eyes of lower life forms who could only stare and wish but do nothing. It was a little frustrating. But it wasn't so bad. In fact, most of them hung around their peers most of the time, for example, supreme dragons hanging out with other supreme dragons and elf grand elders hanging out with other grand elders, and they didn't mind the occasional lustful attention from them at all, sometimes quite the opposite. After all, everybody wanted a mate eventually. On top of that, some of them would go into seclusion for long periods of time, and after all that time, almost any attention would be welcome after that. So it wasn't until Yorma had said such a shocking thing that resonated with their hearts that they even realized that they were having a problem, no matter how insignificant of a problem it was. Titania saw the change in faces of some of the people in the vicinity and felt a surge of joy. How could she possibly not? The more people interested in the idea of covering their reproductive organs, the more traction her clothing business would obtain. As for where the idea of a clothing business had come from, naturally, she had obtained it from Sierra's inheritance. When Sierra had gifted her with knowledge, clothes and business had been included in the memories, not necessarily together, but with the implementation of businesses in the Elven Kingdom, it didn't take long for the most valuable resources in the kingdom to be sold via various businesses, with clothing being one of them. Nevertheless, only a few of the Elven Kingdom's businesses had managed to stretch out of the kingdom itself, dealing with other factions and raking in more resources. But the extent of that was merely the other neighboring factions within the Dawn Forest and nothing outside. This did not mean she was not capable if she put in her best effort to expand the various businesses, but the return on interest was too low, especially in this dangerous world. Every ruler was competing with each other, overtly or not, and their entire race relied on their rulers to be as powerful as possible. So if she had actually made the decision to focus on business rather than cultivation, causing her cultivation to fall behind her peers, such a thing could put the whole kingdom in jeopardy, and then what would be the point of all those businesses? They would only be devoured by somebody else. Ridiculous. But with what was going on now, Titania saw an opportunity to make at least one of her businesses become continental. At a swift pace at that. If she could actually make the clothing business become continent-wide within 5 years, even 10 years, then the resources she would rake in from the entire continent would make the time spent away from cultivating worth it by many folds. What a beautiful dream! All she would have to be worried about was having her life or that of her people be targeted because of the allure that a system that took from the entire continent would have, but she wasn't too worried. She had honed her charm for many years and knew how to de-escalate violent confrontations with many methods, but even if the only option left was to fight, not only was she very powerful by herself, but she'd have the entire Dawn Forest Alliance to back her up. She understood that if it came to that, they'd probably want a cut of the business, but she could afford that. She might even get lucky and they wouldn't even think that the profit of an entire business could be divided. They were very likely to just ask for a big sum up front and leave her alone after that. What joy! The only variable in that situation would be Dragon King Draco, since his loyalty to his sister was greater than his loyalty to the Alliance, but that could be worked out. This is wonderful. Thinking about the benefits that could come from this meeting, Titania's all-white eyes began to shine as her emotions temporarily slipped out of her control. But before she could say anything to provoke more people into feeling upset by their nakedness, the sound of buzzing could be heard in the distance. Her glowing eyes abruptly dimmed and her raised brows dropped. She didn't need to turn around to know what exactly had arrived behind her, but she did anyway, but what she saw made her frown even further. They increase in number too quickly. A few thousand meters away, the sight of a white sparkling smoke could be seen encroaching the land towards them like a tidal wave, making a strangely melodious, buzzing sound that got louder the closer it came. Soon, it got close enough that those who had never seen them before could finally make out their true identity, and they all felt shocked. For what they saw was a far cry from the odd musical smoke that they had perceived from a distance. Not even close. What appeared to be a dense smoke was actually a mass collection of many, many bodies. The bodies were streamlined and divided into 3 indistinct sections, and they had a total of 6 very thin legs that looked woefully impractical. Could they even walk? It certainly didn't look like it, especially since they all contained a pair of thin wings on their backs that they were using to fly. Those two, for that matter, looked completely ineffective, but they were flapping at an insane rate and they were clearly doing their job. The creatures flew through the air at a respectable speed and were rapidly approaching the gathering. On another note, each one could be considered small for a beast. They were certainly not an enlightened race with such an appearance, with only a few at the front having an imposing height of 40 meters or so. But compared to a lot of the beasts here, even that 40-meter height was below average, which was strange since their collective aura was absolutely nothing to scoff about. More than a few high-stage Realm 3 entities could be sensed in that group, and there were even a short few at the 4th realm. That had to be the creatures that were 40 meters tall, because who else would it be? Nothing else in the group was bigger. But still, why were they so small? The abnormality didn't end there either. Their bodies were very strange, looking like they had been made from a material similar to the Dragon King's crystals, which was strange since most beasts were furred or scaled. They were mainly white in color but had silver stripes laced across their entire bodies, with only their legs and what was presumed to be their head being without. And they had 2 giant, weird-looking eyes that were completely silver in color, and a strange, very strange, but dangerous-looking mouth that looked like the pincer of a crab, only much smaller and perfectly symmetrical. Another thing to add was that their entire bodies were glowing. They were all glowing like they had been directly imbued with moonlight. But ignoring the glow, those mouths. They were definitely mandibles. And those creatures had to be insects. It was impossible not to notice at this point. As the insects flew closer, it became apparent that they were some sort of bee. No, not a bee, the bees they knew of were more furry and rotund. These had to be the closely related wasps. Those who were out of the loop couldn't fathom what they were seeing at all. They had of course seen wasps and other insects before, but never had they seen a group of them with this kind of size, color or amount of members. There had to be hundreds of thousands of them, and they certainly had not seen any kind of insect with strength that surpassed the 2nd realm, talk less of the 4th realm. The strangely enchanting sound they were making was also completely abnormal, and the aura they were emitting was considerably daunting. What kind of wasps were these, and where on Iridius had they come from? Unlike them, the people who were in the know, which was most people, like Titania and Yorma, weren't surprised by their appearance at all. Obviously. But they definitely wore grim faces. After all, the last time they had seen these strange creatures, their numbers were much fewer and there was not a single one of them in the 4th realm. That was 7 years ago, year 165, but look at them now. It was honestly terrifying to think about. They had just appeared out of nowhere, and when interrogated about their origins, they would only reply that they were blessed by the moon. This led to some thinking that there was some kind of moon god or goddess who was handing out blessings, causing some to actually start praying to it, thinking that their race were more worthy of its blessing and hoping to seek its divine favor, but so far, there had been no response to these prayers, and on top of the fact that the wasps never claimed the existence of a god, the hype for it had eventually died down. The wasps simply called themselves moonlit wasps, and generally didn't interact with other races. On top of that, despite their hyper-uniqueness, their quality of being was still quite low, only reaching the level of a ferret or a vulture, meaning that on their own they were quite weak. But they were never alone, and the unreal group mentality that they possessed along with the speed at which their cultivation progressed made them an incredible force that nobody with a functioning brain could ignore. Dodo looked at these insects with a difficult expression. As a herbivore but most importantly a guardian who advocated for peace, he admired the way these insects lived. They never caused unprovoked trouble, they kept to themselves, and they liked to create music like the elves, something that he had also taken an interest in. They were great. But there was one teensy maybe worrisome maybe extremely bad problem. And that was that these wasps were not herbivores, they were omnivores. And not only did they have a penchant for meat, but they also had a severe eating problem. The moonlit wasps had established a territory for themselves somewhere between the center and the north of the continent, a decent location where many powerful beasts had once resided. Keyword there being once. Without suspense, they had all been killed and devoured, overwhelmed by the sheer numbers and peculiar intelligence of the wasps. Could you imagine that sometimes they would employ their entire nest to kill a single creature if need be? They were that crazy. Eventually, without a supreme overlord to contend with, they had inevitably claimed dominance of their geographical location. They killed and ate and then killed and ate some more, only taking breaks to play songs and praise the moon. Nobody knew why they hunted for so much food, especially since their actual capacity to eat wasn't that high. But the most popular guess was that it had something to do with their insane birth rate. Whatever the case, since they continued to expand their territory in accordance with their need for food, and showed no signs of slowing down, the day that they affected all the supreme lords in this meeting would soon come to pass. It wasn't a surprise that some harbored the thought of destroying them before such a thing could ever happen. Insects? Nine Flame Queen gazed at the incoming swarm with slightly shaking eyes. Since when did insects become so capable? Or was it that the insects in her continent were trash and these ones were normal? But that probably wasn't likely. The weakness of insects was mainly a body issue rather than an environmental one. The size and density of their bodies was too lacking. This led to a bunch of problems, one of them being that they didn't even have enough room in their genetic makeup to have an affinity for any particular element. But the most pressing one of them all was the fact that their bodies were too weak to handle great amounts of mana, talk less of raw magic energy. Hence, their path in cultivation was forever doomed to be short. Or so she had thought. Thinking back on it, she had always admired the single-minded unity that a few insects like the ants and wasps had when they pursued their goals. It was a little terrifying actually. Often enough times, she would see them performing feats far, far greater than what their individual bodies were capable of performing, just by chucking whatever amount of bodies that their task needed to be complete. There was a time that she had witnessed the corpse of a large eagle submerged in a sea of ants. She didn't know how it died, or why there were so many ants in one location, but she had always had the harrowing thought that maybe, just maybe, those ants were the ones to do it. The ones to actually kill that eagle. This world was bountiful in resources, that was certainly so, but nobody would leave the carcass of an eagle for ants to enjoy. For a beast, the corpse of any life form was a source of strength, and a source of strength was not something that could be ignored. But perhaps one of those pitiful herbivores did it. A few of them were strong enough. Maybe the eagle had been overly bold and paid the price. But just maybe. If that really happened, if just regular ants were capable of killing an eagle, what could a colony that contained Fourth Realm members be able to accomplish? What great feats would they be able to perform if they threw their entire colony onto a single task, or a single enemy? Her powerful mind quickly conjured up scenarios of such a thing and goosebumps spread across her skin. How terrifying. Chad and Aliana were having similar thoughts and their faces became grim like everyone else's. Never had they ever seen insects like this before and it was a worrying prospect. The gathering fell into complete silence as they awaited the moonlit wasps with solemn demeanors. But as one could imagine, that silence soon broke apart as the wasps came close enough for their music to fill the valley. Without asking, they found a space for themselves and soon settled down one by one. But where most of the other factions placed their least important members at the back and left their more powerful members at the front, these wasps settled into a circular formation that had their most powerful members safe in the center and their less important members on the outskirts where they were the most vulnerable. But nobody who knew about their behavior was surprised. Most insects were like this. They may have obtained greater intelligence and comprehensive emotions along with their expanding brains and cultivation, but they had not changed that aspect about themselves at all. Other races like the glacial Saint Deers had more of a one-for-all belief and relied on their powerful members to protect the rest, but these insects were clearly of the all-for-one category and valued only their important members, doing all that they could to protect them even if it cost many of their own lives. And yet still, they had never seen a race more unified. There were no rebellions, there were no disagreements, and there was not a single one of them who wouldn't sacrifice their life for whatever benefit. It was strange enough to call it a phenomenon, a miracle of sorts. Gaia looked at the swarm of wasps with impassive eyes. She had seen and heard about powerful insects and other similar things, the worst among them being the Insecta abyssi, terrifying creatures that had emerged from the abyss with crazy powers and psychotic ambitions that inevitably led them to conquering planets and even worlds. Thankfully, such creatures had never looked the Lole galaxy's way. She had only read about them in ancient texts. The point was, she wasn't afraid of the moonlit wasps that were far, far inferior. She could look at them like any other race, so long as they behaved themselves. And when it came to equality, it wasn't all about equal benefits. Equality also meant holding everyone to the same standard. Queen of the Moonlit, she called out, once more breaking the silence which had returned due to the wasps no longer moving, putting an end to their music. I believe you received the same invite as the rest of us. The one stating to only bring your highest upper echelons. So why is it that you have brought your entire hive? What are you trying to do? Murmurs erupted as people began to show support to her question. They too wondered why the moonlit wasps were being so blatantly audacious. The queen of the elves had only come with a few grand elders, the progenitor of the glacial Saint Deers had only come with a few of his guardians of peace, Beast Emperor Reiko had only come with his subordinate beast kings, she herself had only come with the crystal dragon king and the supreme dragons, and even Yorma was only here with Lily and Hikulu, only 2 of her 10 or so juggernauts. And the list went on. So it went without saying that nobody was pleased with the actions of the moonlit wasps. If one must protect the queen, all must protect the queen. An avalanche of voices broke out in response. A few people in the gathering looked unsettled at that, but Gaia merely narrowed her eyes. Do you know that by blatantly ignoring our rules and disregarding our authority, treating us with disrespect when we have treated you with kindness, that you are putting your queen in danger? Bzzzzz. At once, every wasp began to flap their wings at extreme speeds. Apparently not enough to take off, but enough to create an ominous buzzing sound that filled the gathering with slight dread. Of course, the buzzing was still musical in nature, as seemed to be customary with these moonlit wasps, but it was far from the peaceful music that it was before. Clearly, they didn't take threats to their queen nicely. But in response, every other faction began to release their auras with unmistakable intent to cause harm. They had been wary of the behavior of the insects, mainly because it was so abnormal and everything unknown was something to treat with caution, but when Gaia had pointed out that they were being disrespected, they all agreed but kept their silence, happy for Gaia to take control. But not only did the wasps not relent, they actually dared to get angry? Filthy insects, you're really bold. You want to fight? Come then, let's fight. Let's fight to the death. Draco roared out as his long body coiled into the sky. He then turned his head back and called out. Brother Reiko! I'm tired of these creatures, let's just kill them all. The aura around Reiko became noticeably more dangerous as he glared at the moonlit wasps, but he didn't respond and didn't move either. As much as he wanted to help his sworn brother, he knew that nothing would come of it. And as he expected, something large and black flashed through his vision before Draco's body crashed right back into the ground. Draco Yorma called out, her voice enthralling yet menacious. Nobody would think that the owner of that voice would be an enlightened, it was too powerful, too daunting, too other. Reiko turned to look at her and felt a shiver run down his spine. Those eyes, he thought with trepidation. All 3 of them were glaring at a Draco and they glowed extremely ominously. He wouldn't be surprised if his brother turned to stone the very next second. These are my guests. They are being very unruly at the moment, but they are my guests. Don't you think that you're also being quite bold by trying to attack them in my presence? Draco looked back at her as if he had already turned to stone. It took a short while for him to respond. Forgive me, Yorma. He felt a bit bitter, having to humble himself before so many people, but it was his big sister who had taken care of him on many occasions. And even if that weren't the case, she was still an entity that possessed more than enough strength to make him submit. Yorma continued to glare at him for a few more seconds before she sighed, and looking at that, Reiko had the brief silly thought that she could perhaps kill lesser beings just with that sigh. He even briefly glanced at the weaker moonlit wasps, hoping to see a few of them perish on the spot, but of course nothing happened to them. A sigh couldn't kill people. Yorma looked at her dispirited brother before she stretched forth her large head and gave him a single lick on his head, in between his two antlers. Just be mindful, Draco. Her eyes looked softer when she retracted her head, and although her eyes still glowed, it was not as bright or scary as before. Clearly that effect had been created by a little bit of mana. But just as a few people were inwardly thinking that Yorma's relationship with Draco was quite amusing, the eyes returned to no. The eyes became 10 times freakier than the eyes she had directed at Draco, and they choked up with fear. The giant snake swiveled her head towards the wasps and instantly, a great number of them turned to stone right then and there. Many people froze with shock, but the most shocked people of them all were definitely the birds from the West Continent. Not because of the domineering fatality that left little chance to resist, although that was indeed frightening, but instead because of the startling similarity that the ability had when compared with the ocular power of a particular bird back on their own continent. Pharaoh, the golden rock of cremation. Pharaoh and his golden rock brethren were abnormal existences that had popped out of nowhere with a QOB, quality of being, that rivaled their own. It was extremely astonishing when they had first appeared since there had been little sign of the rising, but when they were first found they already had multiple existences in the third realm, so the suppression that the phoenixes and vermilion birds had jointly placed on them weren't very effective for long. Pharaoh, their alleged progenitor, was naturally the most unique of all the golden rocks. He had something called an evil eye, and it was the evil eye of cremation. It was a third eye on the middle of his forehead, just like Yorma's third eye, but the difference was that it was pale blue in color and gave the impression of blazing flames. What was scary was that he could use that third eye of his to directly ignite someone with pale blue-colored flames that were even hotter than golden rock fire, phoenix fire, and even vermilion fire, and they would swiftly turn into ash. No build-up was needed, no projectile was launched, he would just look at someone and they would start burning. Now he was looking at another being with a third eye, and that person had looked at a group of people who ended up turning into stone. No build-up was needed, no projectile was launched. With a single look, they had become statues. The effects may be different, but the third eye and method of attack was the exact same. That had to be an evil eye. The effects may be different, but the third eye and method of attack was the exact same. That had to be an evil eye. Nine Flame Queen was having similar thoughts and she couldn't help but feel stiff. All this time she had felt indifferent to Yorma's cultivation that rivaled her own, 4th realm, 6th stage, because at the end of the day, she was a beast/monster hybrid and that gave her an enormous advantage. On top of that, although her beast heritage was average, her monster half was nothing to scoff at. She was not only a demon king but a demon king of the elemental race, arguably the most powerful race of monsters. She may have lost dominion over the elementals, but her abilities and raw power had not been taken away at all. Instead, they had been empowered when they had been combined with the lava powers that she obtained from her beast heritage. So it was inevitable that when all of her biological qualifications were calculated together, it resulted in a QOB that became very hard to match. But she knew about the powers of an evil eye, and just look. No words needed to be said. There were a large row of deader-than-dead statues and they had been created by a single look. She was starting to think that her actions of overlooking this being were incredibly foolish and that she needed to evaluate the strength of her possible ally. What a blunder, she thought. But truthfully, when was the last time that she had to consider anyone as a rival? The Phoenix race had more control of the West Continent than her own Purgatory Vermilion race, but that was because of the amount of time they had had to occupy the lands in comparison to her race, not to mention that her race was a much newer one. Chad himself was weaker than her and was no rival at all. She could only think about the lord of all monsters, Azura, the demon king of the savage earthen ogre tribe who had. She didn't even like to think about those times. The creature known as Envy, who was the progenitor of the ice phoenixes before then, was weak when she had first met him, and had only stayed for a few minutes when he became powerful. No other rival had appeared ever since. As the 9 Flame Queen thoughts drifted to her past, the moonlit wasps who had been stunned into silence by the vicious show of power finally reacted with a burst of anger. Squee-ee! Loud chattering sounds could be heard as they kicked up a fuss. their wings beating even faster and some even taking flight. But still, true to their nature, instead of attacking, in vain, which would have no doubt left their queen unprotected, they squeezed closer to her, trying their best to prevent any harm from coming her way. They ended up looking like a giant white and silver ball that convulsed strangely, and they made strange noises all the while. Even then, it could still be considered musical, but compared to the previous harmonious sound of before, the sound they were now creating was chaotic and utterly disorderly. It was like multiple songs were playing at once, and it was loud, very unpleasant to hear. But just before Yorma or even Gaia could interfere, a single voice spoke out. "Calm down." It was spoken softly, but it was still heard above the cacophony of cries, as if the words had been spoken by a higher being, which of course meant that it had been amplified by mana. It was something that anyone could do, but the voice immediately vanquished the chaotic sounds of the moonlit wasps and even caused them to settle down as if the previous events had never happened, which wasn't something that just anyone could do. A few people who looked at that were flabbergasted. The way the wasps were acting, it was as if they would rip out their own wings out of anger at any moment, but within an instant they had suddenly settled down and even started looking around as if they were wondering what everyone was looking at. What was up with these crazy insects? I apologize for the behavior of my race and hope we haven't jeopardized any opportunities. The next time a gathering like this arises, I will try my best to leave the inessential members of my hive behind, or simply not attend in order to prevent grievances. Will you forgive me? The same soft-spoken voice was heard again. At this point, although nobody could see her, they knew who she was. There was only one being who could command the entire moonlit wasp race, and that was the queen herself. And as one could expect of the ruler of the moonlit wasps, her voice was very feminine and melodious. But contrary to expectations, although her voice was clear and unwavering, it did not carry the regal quality that most other rulers had. But that was meaningless. Titania was even surprised by how well-spoken the wasp queen was. She herself had the aid of experience and a few inherited memories concerning the topic that let her speak like it was her profession, but the wasp queen did not. How did she learn how to talk like that? Yorma didn't care about any of that and simply gave a nod. You have been forgiven, but do not let there be a second time. Her eyes returned to normal and she turned her head to look at everyone else. We have already wasted enough time. There are two groups that are still not here, but I no longer wish to wait for them. It is finally time to get to the reason we are all here. The reason why every powerhouse on the continent has been called here today. She then turned her head to Gaia and gave a small bow, a mere tilt of her head. Goddess of the dragons, over to you. Gaia looked upon most of the various groups to make sure that she had their attention. But of course, that was just a maneuver to make herself look more important. After all, she already had her spirit sense spread across the entire gathering. It was pointless to move her head when she could already see all. Nevertheless, in the game of gathering attention and asserting lofty demeanors, she was scoring points. Each of their rulers met her gaze with varying emotions. Some indifferent, some worried, and some excited, but they all were earnest to hear what she had to say. That was all she wanted, so she began to speak. To cut the suspense, I will keep things short and precise. We know the entire world is under dire threat. A few eyes widened at that, but she didn't pause to accommodate their surprise. There is a disastrous menace growing in the south, and its powers are rising so quickly that it would soon reach the point that it would be able to subjugate or simply destroy us all. That threat is known as the Phoenix of Envy, or just Envy. And as some of you can already guess, our guest from another continent over here is part of the same Phoenix race. In fact, he is the progenitor of their race and is as old as magic of this world, like some of us here. His name is Chad, and he must be treated with respect. Everyone turned their gazes to the visitors from the West Continent with either interested or nonchalant eyes, and Chad returned their stares with a simple nod. Gaia continued. Envy can be considered as a traitor of his race that went rogue after committing a heinous crime. Gaia knew that the likelihood of the people listening to her knowing what the word crime meant was all too low, but the context of her sentence should assist them in understanding what she meant, so she continued. Unluckily for the Phoenix race, Envy received bouts of fortune that allowed him to grow and grow until he was powerful enough to challenge the Phoenix King to a war. Actual gasps rang out at that. She wanted to ignore them to save face for the Phoenix King, but someone interrupted before she could. Goddess, you jest. How can a descendant challenge the power of their ancestor? The question was asked by one of the celestial elephant beast kin, something she expected from the little fellows who were obsessed with Apis, but the murmurs of support annoyed her, especially when one of them came from her own side. She turned to the left and looked at the blue-scaled female dragon who had snorted as if she also believed that what she said was a joke, or perhaps she believed what she said and was mocking the Phoenix King. It was the Water Supreme Dragon, Mizali, the one who almost died trying to fight Chad and Nine Flame Queen when they had first appeared, despite having the backup of other supreme dragons. Noticing the gaze of her goddess, her face crumpled into one of guilt and fright, but Gaia didn't do anything further. Instead she continued speaking. I do not jest. In actuality, I am told that Envy isn't quite Chad's descendant, but one of the. She briefly considered exposing Chad as an ex-chicken, most weren't aware, but decided against it. Such a thing would only result in some disdain from a few of the races which she didn't have time for. Birds that he was born with. Chad later became a phoenix, and the crime that the jealous Envy committed is related to the evil method that he performed to become a phoenix of a different kind, an ice phoenix. Some people immediately looked at Aliana, identifying her blue-colored features and cold aura for what it was, but thankfully, nobody said anything. But eventually, his diabolical fortune came to an end and he was caught by the Phoenix King, who chose to torture him in an isolated cave with eternal flames, where he would burn forever. Or so everyone thought. Like a slap to everyone's faces, 2 or so years into his punishment, the Ice Phoenix unlocked a terrifying power. A power so great that it allowed him to rival the potential of the strongest gods. This power is called envy, and it is one of the 7 deadly sins. It went without saying that many eyes began to glow with passion. Power was the most important thing in this world, or at least this era, and everyone wanted to obtain it. What was more enticing than power that rivaled the strongest gods? Suddenly, a deep and ancient sound voice spoke out. It was loud and many covered their ears with irritation. Goddess Gaia, you as the goddess of creation, should be amongst the so-called strongest gods. Does this mean that you can deal with this? Envy? It was Apis, the celestial elephant who spoke. Gaia sighed in response. Everybody knows about my past. I, the goddess of creation, created much of what you all see. At my peak, I could erect or dismantle mountain ranges, spawn or evaporate oceans, generate or destroy continents, and could even create life. I created much of your species before magic was even allowed to prevail in this world. Killing someone like Envy? Done with a single thought. Alas, I was betrayed. To keep things short, my divinity was rendered and I am now a shadow of what I once was. It will one day return to me, as I am an everlasting god, but that will take time. Time that I do not have if I want to deal with Envy alone. After all, the powers that Envy has allow him to gain power quicker than I do since his influence can spread much faster. Do you all remember the day of the green horror? It took a moment, but eventually, many eyes dawned with realization, before an expression of, well, horror took place on their faces. Do you mean to say that the day of the green horror was caused by envy? How call wait? Wait! Lily exclaimed, her voice as seductive as her appearance even in her astonishment. A lot of heads turned her way since it was obvious that she had had an epiphany, but their faces were grim because it was very likely that they were thinking the same thing. I remember now. On each day of horror, everyone who succumbed to the different colors dreamed about strange things before a mighty figure that covered the sky appeared before them. They said it was like a god, and not the. She turned towards Gaia. Weakened god that Gaia is. Gaia didn't react in any way, allowing Lily to speak with less worry. On the day of the green horror, the creature that appeared was supposedly a turquoise-colored bird covered in green icy flames. Could it be? Those that hadn't reached that conclusion for themselves almost yelped with surprise. There were even a few who audibly gasped, drawing a bit of attention their way. That's right, Chad spoke out for the first time, snatching back the attention. That was him. Envy. And although he is not as big or as strong as what those victims portrayed him to be, he is getting stronger. And apparently, he took a deep breath. Apparently, he has begun to conquer entire continents. Murmurs abruptly broke out at that. The words lies, nonsense, and anything synonymous could be heard above the rest, and it was very clear that they didn't believe what Chad was claiming, but he didn't react. He had already foreseen that response. He himself had acted similarly when Pharaoh had informed him of what Envy had done. I do not lie. Which was true, but he really hoped that Pharaoh hadn't been lying either. The amount of humiliation that he would suffer if everything turned out to be a hoax would bury him to death. Quite literally too. The amount of Fourth Realm beings he was enlisting for help wasn't small, and they would kill him if everything turned out to be a lie. But he was sure it was the truth. There was evidence to support Pharaoh's claims, key among them being that not only had many people in his own continent been bespelled by envy's evolution, but also people on this continent. Proving that his power, or at least his potential, was truly enough to become multi-continental. But other than that, and here was why he had made the effort to come all the way to this continent for help, was that when another ruler on my continent came to me and informed me of the worrying actions of envy, he had also brought along with him a duck. It was a duck that had flown or swam, perhaps both, all the way from another continent, and arrived on my own continent covered in injuries. Nobody cared about a random duck being injured, especially if it had indeed traveled by sea. The dwellers of the sea were no joke, and they were becoming an increasingly prevalent problem that prevented those that couldn't fly from venturing too far from the lands. This meant that the origin of the injuries had less of a chance of being related to the main topic of the conversation and was therefore useless information. But they could see where this was going, so they chose to quiet themselves and fasten their attention. Apparently, envy had arrived on his continent one day with hundreds of thousands of never-seen-before flying creatures, and that he had begun a battle of conquest for the entire continent. That Chet trailed off as the absurdity of what he was about to say made even him doubt himself. That didn't take much longer than 3 months, he finished. Expectedly, complete silence was met at his statement. Gaia had already received all the information from Chad in their first meeting, so she wasn't the slightest bit surprised to hear what he said, but even when she heard it the first time, she wasn't all that shocked, because she knew the potential of a god and knew that if they were uncontested, that could grow very, very quickly. The deadly sins seemed to be even greater than average gods, especially when it came to brainwashing and obtaining believers, so she was barely fazed to hear of envy's feats. She only worried about how to deal with the sin when they eventually and inevitably met. However, she had the benefit of experience and expansive knowledge that allowed her to remain calm, something that nobody else in this gathering had. Looking at the various incredulous faces in the gathering, some which were becoming twisted with anger, she knew that she had to intervene before things got out of hand. "I believe Chad is telling the truth," she spoke out. "The 7 deadly sins have the diabolical ability to corrupt the minds of those whose wills are found lacking. You've all seen it yourselves. How many times have one of your followers suddenly changed in attitude, becoming stranger and stranger before a colored symbol reveals itself on their forehead, changing their eye colors and sometimes even other features, and granting greater power that they couldn't have displayed before? Every single one of these people who succumb are passively generating their root sin more power, and even though it's small, with enough of these people a sin can grow in power incredibly quickly. And although for some reason, the black and red sins are showing growth 100x slower than the green one, envy, they are global problems that we will eventually have to deal with. But just imagine. Black and red have been causing a big fuss, no doubt growing in power, but envy is doing it even better, and has been doing so for many years now. To conquer an entire continent or 2. It isn't as far-fetched as you think, especially since according to the duck who reported to Chad, their continent was much smaller than both of ours. As Gaia said all this, she couldn't help but thank the common language that came with the system. It was a marvelous feature that allowed her to freely speak with any being with perfect understanding. It made the miracle that was her speaking to these various brand new species the way she was a possibility. But she didn't have time to think about that right now. She had to discourage the people who were thinking of pledging their allegiance to envy out of fear or whatever other reason. After talking about him as if he were a god king this entire time, presenting proof that was even more daunting than anything she had ever displayed, there were definitely people who were scheming troublesome things, and she couldn't have that at all. "Envy is a calamity that the world has never seen before," she began. "He is a vicious carnation of evil that seeks to either destroy or enslave all life, and would stop at nothing to do so. Some of you here may have come into contact with those who have telepathically conversed with him, and perhaps a few of you here have actually spoken to him for yourself. His words are like honey filled with infinite temptation, and to accept a deal with him almost always sounds completely worth it. But I assure you, it is all deceit," Gaia said as you looked around the gathering. "The main power of envy is his namesake. He can instill within you envious emotions that will corrupt your mind until you are fully branded with his authority. Yes, you would gain impressive powers, and perhaps you would obtain the things that you envied so much, but ultimately, it is at the cost of your entire soul. If envy ordered you to eat your own children, you would do it with a smile. If envy ordered you to give him your mates, you would do it with a smile. If envy ordered you to walk into his mouth and feed him with your entire body, you would do it with a smile. That is what it means to be branded by a sin. And that is why, all of us here must rise against him before he becomes too powerful. Rise against him whilst we still have a chance to resist, or, well, I'm sure you all understand by now. So long as envy exists, we will never have peace. So come, my brethren from the same continent, let us band together to destroy envy once and for all, before it is too late. For a moment, silence spread across the gathering. But then all of a sudden, roar, roar! The Crystal Dragon King let out an explosive roar, quickly followed by Osmont the Supreme Fire Dragon, Mizali the Supreme Water Dragon, and all the other Supreme Dragons. And as if challenged, Draco the Divine Dragon King and the Divine Dragons that had accompanied him also began to let out loud roars. And like this, one by one, different groups of beasts began to express their passion with sound. Only Yorma and her snakes, Titania and her elves, Apis, the moonlit wasps, the 3 legendary birds, and a few others, chose to remain quiet. Me and envy cannot exist under the same sky. Draco yelled, the ever-hot-headed dragon, despite his age, once more acting carelessly as if the incident with Yorma had never occurred. Other like-minded people gave yells of assent and added their own things, but eventually, things calmed down and people fell quiet. But the mood had completely changed. Everyone's eyes glowed with energy, and a few uncontrolled auras were billowing excitedly. War was coming. A war like never before. War was often horrifying and filled with endless bloodshed, but it was also always filled with bountiful opportunities. After all, most of them here were beasts. The corpses of their fallen enemies was one of their greatest nourishments. On top of that, didn't this grand mission mean they were becoming global? If the trajectory of the words exchanged so far were to be taken into consideration, it was natural to think that in their plan of taking down envy, they would be leaving the continent to find him, instead of waiting for him to come here. Otherwise, why else would Chad come all the way here? Just to save their continent instead of his own? What a joke! So for the first time, they would be leaving their continent for another. It was a concept surrounded in danger and peril, but also plentiful benefits. What an opportunity! They didn't know how they'd do it, especially with the increasing danger of the seas, but surely Gaia had a way if she was talking this far. They could barely suppress their aura from leaking out of excitement. You seem very confident, Goddess Gaia. Does this mean you have a sure way to defeat envy? Everyone turned their attention to the owner of the voice they were hearing for the first time, and a few faces twisted in disgust. The voice was deep and steady, a feature that could be considered attractive to most people. But the appearance. To put things simply, he was a toad. Literally a toad. Granted, a very large toad that was over 70 meters tall, but still a toad. His skin was pitch black in color, save for the lighter-colored underbelly, but that was as far as normal things went. The toad was covered from head to toe in obnoxious bright yellow-colored bumps, and each bump seemed to be leaking a greenish-yellow liquid that was viscous in nature, going by how slowly it moved, and they released similar-colored fumes into the air that looked about as poisonous as 10 hiculus. No wonder the closest person to him was 200 meters away. He must have smelled bad too. And those ugly yellow eyes? The creepy way that he sat? The odd undulations of his lower jaw muscles? His eyes that looked at 2 separate things every now and then? The sweaty-looking slickness of his overall body that had nothing to do with his other liquids? Wow! What an ugly creature! He was so ugly that it was impressive. Still, they didn't react too much. They all knew of him. He was an impressive toad creature that had risen to where he was today on his own, hence why he wasn't surrounded by followers like most of the other rulers here. It was definitely something worthy of respect. If it weren't for the inherent toxicness of his powers that prevent people from coming too close, he definitely would have been recruited by one faction or another. His appearance? Not but a breeze in the grand scheme of things. Unfortunately, his personality, coupled with his toxicity that even he couldn't control very well, prevented him from having many friends. He wasn't even strong enough to grab attention, being in the mere first stage of the 4th realm, so he had been mostly ignored not just in the gathering, but also in real life. Nobody cared what he did in his filthy swamps, and if he were to keel over and die one day it would take a long time for people to notice, and only then, because no matter how toxic he was, the corpse of a 4th realm beast was still the corpse of a 4th realm beast. He was a loner through and through. But it was this loner that had never done anything attention-grabbing in his life before, other than rising to the 4th realm, that was now daring to question Goddess Gaia in front of all of them. Surprise aside, they were quite interested in the answer. The way envy had been spoken about this entire time, no, even without that realizing that envy, the person they were targeting, was the initiator of the entire green horror, was enough to make everyone worry. The only reason they weren't too frightened was because Gaia had been speaking quite boldly the entire time. She seemed quite certain of her success. But now that the toad had asked why that was, they suddenly felt the irresistible need to hear the answer. After all, their lives were at risk, they needed to hear all the details. Gaia remained quiet for a moment, but then she spoke. I cannot reveal the answer just yet. Silence descended once more. I knew it. A solemn voice spoke. It was the toad again. This is all a trap. I had been suspecting since the beginning that this was a ruse, but now I know for sure that if I obey any of your requests, I will be walking into certain doom, perhaps even death. Gaia frowned. Toad dash. I believe you when you say that this envy is incredibly powerful, more so than you, Yorma, or anyone else. We've all seen the green horror and heard of the giant green bird, so he's certainly real. But the fact that you want to gather us all to attack something like that? Is that some kind of joke? If you'd let dash. I suspect that you plan to trap us all in some advantageous location, pretending that that is where envy is, and absorb our strengths using one of your many ways, or maybe you are actually an envoy of envy, and want to deliver us straight to him. I had been hoping otherwise, but the holes in your plan are becoming too noticeable. I mean, seriously? You can't even tell us how you plan to defeat envy? Someone else can see what I'm seeing, right? Or is the fumes making me see things? His words had visible effects on the crowd, but nobody made a sound. Are you done? Gaia asked, her tone far darker than before. Well, I have other dash. Silence, nameless toad. You're done. It's my turn to speak now. And if you interrupt me one more time, your life is forfeit. I'd been allowing it this whole time so that I could understand what actually gave you the confidence to cut off my words, but now I see that it is all just pointless drivel. The toad opened his mouth, closed it, then gave a slow nod. Gaia didn't generally like to act this arrogant. It was one thing to rely on might and threats rather than civil convincing words on a regular day, but it made you appear like a brute when you did it in purely social situations that didn't require it. But she was conversing with beasts, and for that matter, beasts which barely had the faintest understanding of diplomacy, unlike beasts on other planets which had much longer histories. The only thing the beasts on this planet currently respected was might. It would make her appear submissive and weak if she just allowed the toad to continue to carelessly interrupt her, which was detrimental, so to counter that a domineering display was needed. Getting him to lower his head was a fine result, so she inwardly sighed and turned to the rest of the crowd to explain herself. The reason I cannot tell you all how I plan to defeat envy is because I am 100% certain that a few of us here have been affected by envy. It's pointless to try and figure out who, because until the point they fully embrace the sin of envy it would rarely show, but the likelihood that at least one person here she gave an intent-filled side glance at the toad, is an envoy of envy, is too high. You may not have even succumbed. But if he has ever made the effort to mentally speak to you before, he can use that mental gateway to hear what you hear and see what you see, even now. She wasn't actually certain of that, but she had heard from Theodore that envy had spoken to him, and had made clear indicators that he could see what Theo saw. The actual requirement for that feat may be higher than what she said, but it definitely was not a problem to exaggerate it. Which is obviously something that we cannot avoid. So when the war comes, I will have to discuss with only trusted individuals how to give us the best outcome and prevent the most losses, but in the end, only I will know how to truly defeat envy. I have a lot to gain like all of you here, but I have the most to lose because of this great burden. She was sure that in this moment, various groups were subtly eyeing each other using their spiritual sense, trying to catch an envoy of envy off guard, and she would be lying if she said she didn't want that, at least for now. It would greatly remove the suspicion from her own back, and that was all to her benefit. But eventually, she would have to make efforts to keep tensions low. At the very least, they were now aware that even their allies could suddenly betray them because of envy. And although that was certainly not a good idea if you wanted to convince people to go to war with you, it would not only enlighten them to a possible threat, but it would also increase the desire for envy's death in their minds. How could they be happy and content knowing that at any moment their friend could stab them in the back because of the orders of envy, without prompt or reason, even if they didn't participate in the war? Even if the slower-minded people weren't thinking those thoughts now, they would eventually, and it would only increase their hate for envy. So at the very least, even if they were useless to the war and died in some ditch later on, the words she said now would spread to the rest of the continent, and the hate it would generate towards envy would prevent more people from succumbing to him. Still, sharper minds like Yorma, Titania, Apis and others were no doubt still suspecting her goals, and that was one of the reasons she had quickly ended her sentence with, "I have a lot to gain like all of you here, but I have the most to lose because of this great burden." What a joke. In reality, she had the most to gain as the controller of everything, and as for the most to lose? Ha! There was little chance of her personally losing in the first place, even if all went wrong and everyone else in the war died. But even if she did lose, wouldn't she, at most, die like everyone else? She had the qualifications to prevent her mind from being enslaved, so what else was there to be afraid of? As for the other reason, it was because just before that, she had stated that she was the only one that would ever know how to defeat envy, which was, no doubt, suspicious. But by saying she had the greatest burden, she was essentially saying that as the one to defeat envy, she would be the one put in the most danger, which was actually true. Especially since the envoys of envy in this meeting, along with the entire forces of envy, would later focus on her when the war started. Anywho, saying what she said went a great way to prevent people from asking her about what she knew out of pride. She had learnt long ago that it was always how you said things, not what you said, that mattered most. "How can we trust you?" A voice spoke out after another bout of silence. "This fat toad is still so bold?" Gaia inwardly asked with slight surprise. Now, she was sure that he had an agenda. When she had spoken about possible envoys of envy, she had looked towards the toad on purpose to drive suspicion his way. Not for any great particular reason, it was more because it was extremely easy to do and was beneficial. This was a creature that had tried to smear her reputation, let him suffer a bit. That was roughly her thought process at the time. Of course, a part of her actually did suspect that he was an envoy that was trying to sow discord, so her passive attack wasn't completely unjustified, but it hadn't been that important in her mind when she said it. The toad may have a lot of reason to feel envy, but he had never shown any of the behavioral patterns before, so her suspicion was low. He never seemed to yearn, never seemed to hate, and was seemingly content alone in his swamp even if he was a bit grumpy. But now her suspicions were beginning to ring like bells. Perhaps he was just an extremely wary person, but he was questioning her at his own risk, and that was not the trait of a cautious person. If he really were cautious, he would have chosen to hide from the war entirely. He'd have pretended to listen, not arousing suspicion, and then as soon as the gathering was over or whenever he felt the need, he would vanish and never appear in public. Why should he stay here to warn the others? To help the same people that had treated him like air or even disgust, out of the goodness of his heart? No way. It was in his best interest to vanish. But no, instead of doing that, he was publicly stating that she, the goddess of creation, was trying to scheme against everyone? Even a fool would refrain from such a thing unless they were seeking to suffer. And not necessarily because she would do anything, but because her devout followers would be the ones to descend on him first. All the dragons had been glaring at him for a while now, and in such a state, he could still muster the courage to ask, "How could we trust you?" If she didn't realize that something odd was going on by now, then all the experience she had accumulated in her past immortal life would have been in vain. But in any case, she had been questioned and now she had to answer. "I am a goddess. And not a lowly one either. Whether I've fallen or not, I am the goddess of creation, and my mind is not something that envy can hope to affect, no matter how capable he becomes. It is impossible for me to be an envoy of envy, but that's not enough for you, is it? You're probably thinking that I may still be an ally, or that even if that weren't the case, I may still be harboring some kind of sinister plot of my own. Whatever heinous thing you think I'm planning, you are wrong. I am the creator." As soon as her words fell, multiple globes of golden light formed around her, which in itself wasn't anything impressive, but when those lights started to shiver and turn into flesh and blood animals, nobody could keep their calm any longer. Birds formed and flew away, rodents formed and scurried off, spiders formed and crawled away, and much more. All kinds of small animals were brought into existence out of thin air, and they fled in random directions in very lifelike manners. They were real. Reiko and other similar furred animals had their hackles raised as they shivered. Apis the giant celestial elephant actually stumbled backwards. Chat and the other two legendary birds had their feathers frozen stiff, others yelped out aloud, and even Yorma's eyes had constricted to the max. Would I create life, only to harm it for pitiful gains? Do I look mortal like you? Gaia spoke once more, but this time her voice sounded transcendent, and in that moment, she let the full weight of her age show in her eyes, her two golden orbs freezing over with million-year-old ice and desolation, causing those that met her gaze to seize up from a fear that emerged from their very instincts. A primordial fear. They all felt it, even Yorma, and it was then that they confirmed that she really was a god. They still didn't fully know what a god was or what it really meant to be one, other than it meaning that you were exceedingly powerful. But now they knew that it was something other. Something far above what they were. What was that word she used? Mortal? The common language feature of the system allowed them to know what she was talking about to an extent, and what they vaguely understood from that word was being with finite power and lifespan. She, clearly wasn't that. Not even close. Not with those eyes. Gaia wasn't even utilizing her aura. She just looked at them with those baleful eyes, and they felt the control they had over their own bodies strip away from them. They were unable to move, talk less of putting up some type of resistance, and in that moment it became very clear to them that if she wanted them dead, there was no need for some kind of elaborate trap. She already possessed the ability to kill them all. This was the power of a god. This toad just might get us killed. And I even believed him for a second. Fuck. If I live past this day, I'll crush him even if it's the last thing I do. Many of the thoughts could be summarized as that. Evidently, under the effect of Gaia's past immortal influence, their way of thinking was no longer coherent, and the bone-deep fear that they weren't used to feeling was driving them towards madness. It really wasn't quite fair, the dominion that an immortal could have even in their next life. But maybe that was a wrong thought to have. Perhaps it was fully deserved after what was sacrificed to get there.